Stories of Futures Past presents 5 stories featuring horror science fiction. Volume 2. Where the World is Quiet by Henry Kuttner. The Walls by Keith Laumer. The Cottage by Frank Belknap Long. The Belt by Wallace West. Strain by L. Ron Hubbard.
Where the World is Quiet by Henry Kuttner, writing as C.H. Liddell. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, May 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Frau Raphael drew the llama wool blanket closer about his narrow shoulders, shivering in the cold wind that screamed down from Huascan. His face held great pain. I rose, walked to the door of the hut, and peered through fog at the shadowy haunted lands that lifted toward the sky, the Cordilleras that make a rampart along Peru's eastern border. "There's nothing," I said. "Only the fog, Frau Raphael." He made the sign of the cross on his breast. "It is the fog that brings the terror," he said. "I tell you, Senor White, I have seen strange things these last few months, impossible things. You are a scientist. Though we are not of the same religion, you also know that there are powers not of this earth." I didn't answer, so he went on. 3 months ago it began, after the earthquake. A native girl disappeared. She was seen going into the mountains, toward Huascan along the pass, and she did not come back. I sent men out to find her. They went up the pass, found the fog grew thicker and thicker until they were blind and could see nothing. Fear came to them, and they fled back down the mountain. A week later, another girl vanished. We found her footprints. The same canyon? See, and the same result. Now 7 girls have gone, one after the other, all in the same way. And I, Senor White. Frau Raphael's pale, tired face was sad as he glanced down at the stumps of his legs. I could not follow, as you see. 4 years ago an avalanche crippled me. My bishop told me to return to Lima, but I prevailed on him to let me remain here, for these natives are my people, Senor. They know and trust me. The loss of my legs has not altered that." I nodded. "I can see the difficulty now, though." "Exactly. I cannot go to Huascan and find out what has happened to the girls. The natives, well, I chose 4 of the strongest and bravest and asked them to take me up the pass. I thought that I could overcome their superstitions, but I was not successful." "How far did you go?" I asked. "A few miles, but not more than that. The fog grew thicker until we were blinded by it, and the way was dangerous. I could not make the men go on." Frau Raphael closed his eyes wearily. "They talked of old Inca gods and devils, Manco Capac and Oeohuaco, the children of the sun. They are very much afraid, Senor White. They huddle together like sheep and believe that an ancient god has returned and is taking them away one by one. And one by one they are taken." "Only young girls," I mused, "and no coercion is used apparently. What's up toward Huascan?" "Nothing but wild llamas and the condors. And snow, cold, desolation. These are the Andes, my friend." "Okay," I said. "It sounds interesting. As an anthropologist, I owe it to the Foundation to investigate. Besides, I'm curious. Superficially, there's nothing very strange about the affair. 7 girls have disappeared in the unusually heavy fogs we've had ever since the earthquake. Nothing more." I smiled at him. "However, I think I'll take a look around and see what's so attractive about Huascan." "I shall pray for you," he said. "Perhaps. Well, senor, for all the loss of my legs, I am not a weak man. I can stand much hardship. I can ride a burro." "I don't doubt your willingness, Fra Raphael," I said, "but it's necessary to be practical. It's dangerous, and it's cold up there. Your presence would only handicap me. Alone, I can go faster. Remember, I don't know how far I'll have to travel." The priest sighed. "I suppose you're right. When? Now, my burro's packed." "Your porters?" "They won't go," I said wryly. "They've been talking to your villagers. It doesn't matter. I'll go it alone." I put out my hand, and Fra Raphael gripped it strongly. "Vaya con Dios," he said. I went out into the bright Peruvian sunlight. The Indios were standing in straggling knots, pretending not to watch me. My porters were nowhere in evidence. I grinned, yelled a sardonic goodbye, and started to lead the burro toward the pass. The fog vanished as the sun rose, but it still lay in the mountain canyons toward the west. A condor circled against the sky. In the thin, sharp air, the sound of a distant rockfall was distinctly audible. White Huascan towered far away. A shadow fell on me as I entered the pass. The burro plodded on, patient and obedient. I felt a little chill. The fog began to thicken. Yes, the Indios had talked to me. I knew their language, their old religion. Bastard descendants of the Incas, they still preserved a deep-rooted belief in the ancient gods of their ancient race, who had fallen with Huayna Capac, the great Inca, a year before Pizarro came raging into Peru. I know the Quichua, the old tongue of the mother race, and so I learned more than I might have otherwise. Yet I had not learned much. The Indios said that something had come into the mountains near Huascan. They were willing to talk about it, but they knew little. They shrugged with apathetic fatalism. It called the young virgins, no doubt for a sacrifice. Quien sabe? Certainly the strange, thickening fog was not of this earth. Never before in the history of mankind had there been such a fog. It was, of course, the earthquake that had brought the visitant, and it was folly to seek it out. Well, I was an anthropologist, and knew the value of even such slight clues as this. Moreover, my job for the Foundation was done. My specimens had been sent through to Callao by pack train, and my notes were safe with Fra Raphael. Also, I was young, and the lure of far places and their mysteries was hot in my blood. I hoped I'd find something odd, even dangerous, at Huascan. I was young, therefore somewhat of a fool. The first night I camped in a little cave, sheltered from the wind and snug enough in my fleece-lined sleeping bag. There were no insects at this height. It was impossible to make a fire, for there was no wood. I worried a bit about the burro freezing in the night. But he survived, and I repacked him the next morning with rather absurd cheerfulness. The fog was thick, yes, but not impenetrable. There were tracks in the snow where the wind had not covered them. A girl had left the village the day before my arrival, which had made my task all the easier. So I went up into that vast, desolate silence, the fog closing in steadily, getting thicker and thicker, the trail getting narrower until at last it was a mere track. And then I was moving blind. I had to feel my way, step by step, leading the burro. Occasional tracks showed through the mist, showed that the native girl had walked swiftly, had run in places, so I assumed that the fog was less dense when she had come by this way. As it happened, I was quite wrong about that. We were on a narrow path above a gorge when I lost the burrow. I heard a scrambling and clashing of hoofs on rock behind me. The rope jerked out of my hand, and the animal cried out almost articulately as it went over. I stood frozen, pressing against the stone, listening to the sound of the burrow's fall. Finally, the distant noise died in a faint trickling of snow and gravel that faded into utter silence. So thick was the fog that I had seen nothing. I felt my way back to where the path had crumbled and rotten rock had given way under the burrow's weight. It was possible for me to retrace my steps, but I did not. I was sure that my destination could not be much further. A lightly clad native girl could not have gone so far as Huascan itself. No, probably that day I would reach my goal. So I went on, feeling my way through the thick, silent fog. I was able to see only a few inches ahead of me for hours. Then, abruptly, the trail grew clearer, until at last I was moving in the shadowless, unearthly mist over hard-packed snow, following the clearly marked footprints of a girl's sandals. Then they vanished without warning, those prints, and I stood hesitant, staring around. I could see nothing, but a brighter glow in the misty canopy overhead marked the sun's position. I knelt and brushed away the snow with my hands, hoping to undo the wind's concealing work. But I found no more footprints. Finally, I took my bearings as well as I could, and ploughed ahead in the general direction the girl had been travelling. My compass told me I was heading due north. The fog was a living, sentient thing now, secretive, shrouding the secret that lay beyond its grey wall. Suddenly I was conscious of a change. An electric tingle coursed through my body. Abruptly, the fog wall brightened. Dimly, as through a translucent pane, I could make out vague images ahead of me. I began to move toward the images, and suddenly the fog was gone. Before me lay a valley. Blue-white moss carpeted it, except where reddish boulders broke the blueness. Here and there were trees. At least I assumed they were trees, despite their unfamiliar outline. They were like banyans, having dozens of trunks narrow as bamboo. Blue-leafed, they stood like immense bird cages on the pallid moss. The fog closed in behind the valley and above it. It was like being in a huge sunlit cavern. I turned my head, saw a grey wall behind me. Beneath my feet, the snow was melting and running in tiny, trickling rivulets among the moss. The air was warm and stimulating as wine. A strange and abrupt change, impossibly strange. I walked toward one of the trees, stopped at a reddish boulder to examine it, and surprise caught at my throat. It was an artifact. A crumbling ruin, the remnant of an ancient structure whose original appearance I could not fathom. The stone seemed iron-hard. There were traces of inscription on it, but eroded to illegibility, and I never did learn the history of those enigmatic ruins. They did not originate on Earth. There was no sign of the native girl, and the resilient moss retained no tracks. I stood there, staring around, wondering what to do now. I was tense with excitement, but there was little to see, just that valley covering perhaps a half-mile before the fog closed in around it. Beyond that, I did not know what lay beyond that. I went on, into the valley, eyeing my surroundings curiously in the shadowless light that filtered through the shifting roof of fog. Foolishly, I expected to discover Incan artifacts. The crumbled red stones should have warned me. They were, I think, harder than metal, yet they had been here long enough for the elements to erode them into featureless shards. Had they been of earthly origin, they would have antedated mankind, antedated even the Neanderthaler man. Curious how our minds are conditioned to run in anthropomorphic lines. I was, though I did not know it, walking through a land that had its beginnings outside the known universe. The blue trees hinted at that. The crimson ruins told me that clearly. The atmospheric conditions, the fog, the warmth high up in the Cordilleras, was certainly not natural. Yet I thought the explanation lay in some geological warp, volcanic activity, subterranean gas vents. My vision reached a half-mile, no farther. As I went on, the misty horizon receded. The valley was larger than I had imagined. It was like Elysium, where the shades of dead men stroll in the garden of Proserpine. Streamlets ran through the blue moss at intervals, chill as death from the snowy plains hidden in the fog. A sleepy world of streams. The ruins altered in appearance as I went on. The red blocks were still present, but there were now also remnants of other structures, made by a different culture, I thought. The blue trees grew more numerous. Leafy vines covered most of them now, saffron-tinted, making each strange tree a little room screened by the lattice of the vines. As I passed close to one, a faint clicking sounded, incongruously like the tapping of typewriter keys, but muffled. I saw movement and turned, my hand going to the pistol in my belt. The thing came out of a tree hut and halted, watching me. I felt it watching me, though it had no eyes. It was a sphere of what seemed to be translucent plastic, glowing with shifting rainbow colours, and I sensed sentience, intelligence, in its horribly human attitude of watchful hesitation. 4 feet in diameter it was, and featureless save for 3 ivory elastic tentacles that supported it, and a fringe of long, whip-like cilia about its diameter. Its waist, I thought. It looked at me, eyeless and cryptic. The shifting colours crawled over the plastic globe. Then it began to roll forward on the 3 supporting tentacles with a queer, swift gliding motion. I stepped back, jerking out my gun and levelling it. "Stop!" I said, my voice shrill. "Stop!" It stopped, quite as though it understood my words or the gesture of menace. The cilia fluttered about its spherical body. Bands of lambent colour flashed. I could not rid myself of the curious certainty that it was trying to communicate with me. Abruptly, it came forward again purposefully. I tensed and stepped back, holding the gun aimed. My finger was tightening on the trigger when the thing stopped. I backed off, nervously tense, but the creature did not follow. After I had got about 50 yards away, it turned back and retreated into the hut-like structure in the banyan tree. After that, I watched the trees warily as I passed them, but there were no other visitations of that nature. Scientists are reluctant to relinquish their so-called logic. As I walked, I tried to rationalize the creature, to explain it in the light of current knowledge. That it had been alive was certain, yet it was not protoplasmic in nature. A plant developed by mutation? Perhaps. But that theory did not satisfy me, for the thing had possessed intelligence, though of what order I did not know. But there were the 7 native girls, I reminded myself. My job was to find them, and quickly too. I did at last find them. 6 of them, anyway. They were sitting in a row on the blue moss, facing one of the red blocks of stone, their backs toward me. As I mounted a little rise, I saw them, motionless as bronze statues, and as rigid. I went down toward them, tense with excitement, expectancy. Odd that 6 native girls sitting in a row should fill me with such feeling. They were so motionless that I wondered as I approached them if they were dead. But they were not, nor were they, in the true sense of the word, alive. I gripped one by the bare shoulder, found the flesh surprisingly cold, and the girl seemed not to feel my touch. I swung her around to face me, and her black, empty eyes looked off into the far distance. Her lips were tightly compressed, slightly cyanosed. The pupils of her eyes were inordinately dilated, as if she was drugged. Indian style, she squatted cross-legged like the others. As I pulled her around, she toppled down on the moss, making no effort to stop herself. For a moment she lay there. Then, with slow, puppet-like motions, she returned to her former position and resumed that blank staring into space. I looked at the others. They were alike in their sleep-like withdrawal. It seemed as if their minds had been sucked out of them, that their very selves were elsewhere. It was a fantastic diagnosis, of course, but the trouble with those girls was nothing a physician could understand. It was psychic in nature, obviously. I turned to the first one and slapped her cheeks. "Wake up!" I commanded. "You must obey me. Waken!" But she gave no sign of feeling, of seeing. I lit a match, and her eyes focused on the flame, but the size of her pupils did not alter. A shudder racked me. Then, abruptly, I sensed movement behind me. I turned. Over the blue moss, the 7th Indio girl was coming toward us. "Miranda," I said, "can you hear me?" Fra Raphael had told me her name. Her feet, I saw, were bare, and white frostbite blotches marked them. But she did not seem to feel any pain as she walked. Then I became aware that this was not a simple Indio girl. Something deep within my soul suddenly shrank back with instinctive revulsion. My skin seemed to crawl with a sort of terror. I began to shake so that it was difficult to draw my gun from its holster. There was just this young native girl walking slowly toward me, her face quite expressionless, her black eyes fixed on emptiness. Yet she was not like other Indios, not like the 6 other girls sitting behind me. I can only liken her to a lamp in which a hot flame burned. The others were lamps that were dead, unlit. The flame in her was not the one that had been kindled on this earth, or in this universe, or in this space-time continuum either. There was life in the girl who had been Miranda Vaya, but it was not human life. Some distant, skeptical corner of my brain told me that this was pure insanity, that I was deluded, hallucinated. Yes, I knew that. But it did not seem to matter. The girl who was walking so quietly across the blue yielding moss had wrapped about her, like an invisible, intangible veil, something of the alienage that men, through the eons, have called divinity. No mere human, I thought, could touch her. But I felt fear, loathing, emotions not associated with divinity. I watched, knowing that presently she would look at me, would realize my presence. Then, well, my mind would not go beyond that point. She came forward and quietly seated herself with the others at the end of the line. Her body stiffened rigidly. Then the veil of terror seemed to leave her, like a cloak falling away. Abruptly she was just an Indio girl, empty and drained as the others, mindless and motionless. The girl beside her rose suddenly with a slow, fluid motion, and the crawling horror hit me again. The alien power had not left. It had merely transferred itself to another body. And this second body was as dreadful to my senses as the first had been. In some subtly monstrous way, its terror impressed itself on my brain, though all the while there was nothing overt, nothing visibly wrong. The strange landscape, bounded by fog, was not actually abnormal, considering its location high in the Andes. The blue moss, the weird trees, they were strange, but possible. Even the 7 native girls were a normal part of the scene. It was the sense of an alien presence that caused my terror, a fear of the unknown. As the newly possessed girl rose, I turned and fled, deathly sick, feeling caught in the grip of a nightmare. Once I stumbled and fell. As I scrambled wildly to my feet, I looked back. The girl was watching me, her face tiny and far away. Then, suddenly, abruptly, it was close. She stood within a few feet of me. I had not moved, nor seen her move, but we were all close together again, the 7 girls and I. Hypnosis? Something of that sort. She had drawn me back to her, my mind blacked out and unresisting. I could not move. I could only stand motionless while that alien being dwelling within human flesh reached out and thrust frigid fingers into my soul. I could feel my mind laid open, spread out like a map before the inhuman gaze that scanned it. It was blasphemous and shameful, and I could not move or resist. I was flung aside as the psychic grip that held me relaxed. I could not think clearly. That remote delving into my brain had made me blind, sick, frantic. I remember running, but I remember very little of what followed. There are vague pictures of blue moss and twisted trees, of coiling fog that wrapped itself about me, trying futilely to hold me back, and always there was the sense of a dark and nameless horror just beyond vision, hidden from me, though I was not hidden from its eyeless gaze. I remember reaching the wall of fog, saw it loomed before me, plunged into it, raced through cold greyness, snow crunching beneath my boots. I recall emerging again into that misty valley of Abaddon. When I regained complete consciousness, I was with La. A coolness as of limpid water moved through my mind, cleansing it, washing away the horror, soothing and comforting me. I was lying on my back, looking up at an arabesque pattern of blue and saffron. Grey-silver light filtered through a lacy filigree. I was still weak, but the blind terror no longer gripped me. I was inside a hut formed by the trunks of one of the banyan-like trees. Slowly, weakly, I rose on one elbow. The room was empty except for a curious flower that grew from the dirt floor beside me. I looked at it dazedly, and so I met La. She was of purest white, the white of alabaster, but with a texture and warmth that stone does not have. In shape, well, she seemed to be a great flower, an unopened tulip-like blossom 5 feet or so tall. The petals were closely enfolded, concealing whatever sort of body lay hidden beneath, and at the base was a convoluted pedestal that gave the odd impression of a ruffled tiny skirt. Even now I cannot describe La coherently. A flower, yes, but very much more than that. Even in the first glimpse I knew that La was more than just a flower. I was not afraid of her. She had saved me, I knew, and I felt complete trust in her. I lay back as she spoke to me telepathically, her words and thoughts forming within my brain. You are well now, though still weak. But it is useless for you to try to escape from this valley. No one can escape. The other has powers I do not know, and those powers will keep you here. I said, You are? A name formed within my mind. La. I am not of your world. A shudder shook her, and her distress forced itself on me. I stood up, swaying with weakness. La drew back, moving with a swaying, bobbing gait, oddly like a curtsy. Behind me, a clicking sounded. I turned, saw the many-coloured sphere force itself through the banyan trunks. Instinctively my hand went to my gun, but a thought from La halted me. It will not harm you. It is my servant. She hesitated, groping for a word. "A machine, a robot. It will not harm you." I said, "Is it intelligent?" "Yes, but it is not alive. Our people made it. We have many such machines." The robot swayed toward me, the rim of cilia flashing and twisting. La said, "It speaks thus, without words or thought." She paused, watching the sphere, and I sensed dejection in her manner. The robot turned to me. The cilia twisted lightly about my arm, tugging me toward La. I said, "What does it want?" "It knows that I am dying," La said. That shocked me. "Dying? No!" "It is true. Here in this alien world I do not have my usual food, so I will die. To survive I need the blood of mammals, but there are none here save those 7 the other has taken, and I cannot use them for they are now spoiled." I didn't ask La what sort of mammals she had in her own world. That's what the robot wanted when it tried to stop me before, isn't it? "He wanted you to help me, yes, but you are weak from the shock you have had. I cannot ask you." I said, "How much blood do you need?" At her answer, I said, "All right. You saved my life. I must do the same for you. I can spare that much blood easily. Go ahead." She bowed toward me, a fluttering white flame in the dimness of the tree room. A tendril flicked out from among her petals, wrapped itself about my arm. It felt cool, gentle as a woman's hand. I felt no pain. "You must rest now," La said. "I will go away, but I shall not be long." The robot clicked and chattered, shifting on its tentacle legs. I watched it, saying, "La, this can't be true. Why am I believing impossible things?" "I have given you peace," she told me. "Your mind was dangerously close to madness. I have drugged you a little, physically, so your emotions will not be as strong for a while. It was necessary to save your sanity." It was true that my mind felt. Was drugged the word? My thoughts were clear enough, but I felt as if I was submerged in transparent but dark water. There was an odd sense of existing in a dream. I remembered Swinburne's lines. "Here, where the world is quiet. Here, where all trouble seems. Dead winds and spent waves riot in doubtful dreams of dreams." "What is this place?" I asked. La bent toward me. "I do not know if I can explain. It is not quite clear to me. The robot knows. He is a reasoning machine. Wait." She turned to the sphere. Its cilia fluttered in quick, complicated signals. La turned back to me. "Do you know much of the nature of time? That it is curved, moves in a spiral?" She went on to explain, but much of her explanation I did not understand. Yet I gathered enough to realize that this valley was not of Earth, or rather, it was not of the Earth I knew. "You have geological disturbances, I know. The strata are tumbled about, mixed one with another." I remembered what Fra Raphael had said about an earthquake 3 months before. La nodded toward me. "But this was a time slip. The space-time continuum is also subject to great strains and stresses. It buckled, and strata, time sectors, were thrust up to mingle with others. This valley belongs to another age, as do I and the machine, and also the other." She told me what had happened. There had been no warning. One moment she had been in her own world, her own time. The next she was here with her robot, and with the other. "I do not know the origin of the other. I may have lived in either your future or your past. This valley, with its ruined stone structures, is probably part of your future. I had never heard of such a place before. The other may be of the future also. Its shape I do not know." She told me more, much more. The other, as she called it, giving the entity a thought form that implied complete alienage, had a strangely chameleon-like method of feeding. It lived on life force, as well as I could understand, draining the vital powers of a mammal vampirically, and it assumed the shape of its prey as it fed. It was not possession, in the strictest sense of the word. It was a sort of merging. Humanity is inclined to invest all things with its own attributes, forgetting that outside the limitations of time and space and size, familiar laws of nature do not apply. So even now, I do not know all that lay behind the terror in that Peruvian valley. This much I learned. The other, like La and her robot, had been cast adrift by a time slip, and thus marooned here. There was no way for it to return to its normal time sector. It had created the fog wall to protect itself from the direct rays of the sun, which threatened its existence. Sitting there in the filigreed silver twilight beside La, I had a concept of teeming universes of space-time, of an immense spiral of lives and civilizations, races and cultures, covering an infinite cosmos. And yet, what had happened? Very little in that inconceivable infinity. A rift in time, a dimensional slip, and a sector of land and 3 buildings on it had been wrenched from their place in time and transported to our time stratum. A robot, a flower that was alive and intelligent and feminine, and the other. "The native girls," I said. "What will happen to them?" "They are no longer alive," La told me. "They still move and breathe, but they are dead, sustained only by the life force of the other. I do not think it will harm me. Apparently it prefers other food." "That's why you've stayed here?" I asked. The shining velvety calyx swayed. "I shall die soon. For a little while I thought that I might manage to survive in this alien world, this alien time. Your blood has helped." The cool tentacle withdrew from my arm. "But I lived in a younger time, where space was filled with certain energizing vibratory principles. They have faded now almost to nothing, to what you call cosmic rays, and these are too weak to maintain my life. No, I must die, and then my poor robot will be alone." I sensed elfin amusement in that last thought. "It seems absurd to you that I should think affectionately of a machine. But in our world there is a rapport, a mental symbiosis, between robot and living beings." There was a silence. After a while I said, "I'd better get out of here, get help, to end the menace of the other." What sort of help, I did not know. Was the other vulnerable? La caught my thoughts. "In its own shape it is vulnerable, but what that shape is, I do not know. As for your escaping from this valley, you cannot. The fog will bring you back." "I've got my compass." I glanced at it, saw that the needle was spinning at random. La said, "The other has many powers. Whenever you go into the fog, you will always return here." "How do you know all this?" I asked. "My robot tells me. A machine can reason logically, better than a colloid brain." I closed my eyes, trying to think. Surely it should not be difficult me to retrace my steps, to find a path out of this valley. Yet I hesitated, feeling a strange impotence. "Can't your robot guide me?" I persisted. "He will not leave my side. Perhaps—" La turned to the sphere, and the cilia fluttered excitedly. "No," she said, turning back to me. "Built into his mind is one rule, never to leave me. He cannot disobey that. I couldn't ask La to go with me. Somehow I sensed that the frigid cold of the surrounding mountains would destroy her swiftly. I said, "It must be possible for me to get out of here. I'm going to try anyway." "I'll be waiting," she said, and did not move as I slipped out between two trunks of the banyan-like tree. It was daylight, and the silvery greyness overhead was palely luminous. I headed for the nearest rampart of fog. La was right. Each time I went into that cloudy fog barrier, I was blinded. I crept forward step by step, glancing behind me at my footprints in the snow, trying to keep in a straight line, and presently I would find myself back in the valley. I must have tried a dozen times before giving up. There were no landmarks in that all-concealing greyness, and only by sheerest chance would anyone blunder into this valley, unless hypnotically summoned like the Indio girls. I realized that I was trapped. Finally I went back to La. She hadn't moved an inch since I had left, nor had the robot apparently. "La," I said, "La, can't you help me?" The white flame of the flower was motionless, but the robot's cilia moved in quick signals. La moved at last. "Perhaps," her thought came, "unless both induction and deduction fail, my robot has discovered a chance for you. The other can control your mind through emotions, but I too have some power over your mind. If I give you strength, wall you with a psychic shield against intrusion, you may be able to face the other, but you cannot destroy it unless it is in its normal shape. The Indio girls must be killed first." "Killed?" I felt a sense of horror at the thought of killing those poor simple native girls. "They are not actually alive now. They are now a part of the other. They can never be restored to their former life." "How will destroying them help me?" I asked. Again La consulted the robot. "The other will be driven from their bodies. It will then have no hiding place and must resume its own form. Then it can be slain." La swayed and curtsied away. "Come," she said. "It is in my mind that the other must die. It is evil, ruthlessly selfish, which is the same thing. Until now I have not realized the solution to this evil being, but seeing into your thoughts has clarified my own, and my robot tells me that unless I aid you, the other will continue ravening into your world. If that happens, the time pattern will be broken. I do not quite understand, but my robot makes no mistakes. The other must die." She was outside of the banyan now, the sphere gliding after her. I followed. The three of us moved swiftly across the blue moss, guided by the robot. In a little while we came to where the 6 Indio girls were squatting. They had apparently not moved since I had left them. "The other is not here," La said. The robot held me back as La advanced toward the girls, the skirt-like frill at her base convoluting as she moved. She paused beside them, and her petals trembled and began to unfold. From the tip of that great blossom a fountain of white dust spurted up. Spores or pollen, it seemed to be. The air was cloudy with the whiteness. The robot drew me back again. I sensed danger. The pollen seemed to be drawn toward the Indios, spun toward them in dancing mist motes. It settled on their bronzed bodies, their limbs and faces. It covered them like a veil until they appeared to be 6 statues, white as cold marble, there on the blue moss. La's petals lifted and closed again. She swayed toward me, her mind sending a message into mine. "The other has no refuge now," she told me. "I have slain the girls." "They're dead?" My lips were dry. "What semblance of life they had left is now gone. The other cannot use them again. La swayed toward me. A cool tentacle swept out, pressing lightly on my forehead. Another touched my breast above the heart. "I give you of my strength," La said. "It will be as a shield and buckler to you. The rest of the way you must go alone." Into me tide of power flowed. I sank into cool depths, passionless and calm. Something was entering my body, my mind and soul, drowning my fears, stiffening my resolve. Strength of La was now my strength. The tentacles dropped away, their work done. The robot's cilia signaled, and La said, "Your way lies there. That temple, do you see it?" I saw it. Far in the distance, half shrouded by the fog, a scarlet structure, not ruined like the others, was visible. "You will find the other there. Slay the last Indio, then destroy the other." I had no doubt now of my ability to do that. A new power seemed to lift me from my feet, send me running across the moss. Once I glanced back to see La and her robot standing motionless, watching me. The temple enlarged as I came nearer. It was built of the same reddish stone as the other ruined blocks I had seen, but erosion had weathered its harsh angles till nothing now remained but a rounded, smoothly sculptured monolith, 20 feet tall, shaped like a rifle shell. The doorway gaped in the crimson wall. I paused for a moment on the threshold. In the dimness within, a shadow stirred. I stepped forward, finding myself in a room that was tall and narrow, the ceiling hidden in gloom. Along the walls were carvings I could not clearly see. They gave a suggestion of inhuman beings that watched. It was dark, but I could see the Indio girl who had been Miranda Vaya. Her eyes were on me, and even through the protecting armor of La strength, I could feel their terrible power. The life in the girl was certainly not human. "Destroy her," my mind warned. "Destroy her, quickly!" But as I hesitated, a veil of darkness seemed to fall upon me. Utter cold, a frigidity as of outer space, lanced into my brain. My senses reeled under the assault. Desperately, blind and sick and giddy, I called on the reserve strength La had given me. Then I blacked out. When I awoke, I saw smoke coiling up from the muzzle of the pistol in my hand. At my feet lay the Indio girl, dead. My bullet had crashed into her brain, driving out the terrible dweller there. My eyes were drawn to the farther wall. An archway gaped there. I walked across the room, passed under the archway. Instantly, I was in complete Stygian darkness. But I was not alone. The power of the other struck me like a tangible blow. I have no words to tell of an experience so completely disassociated from human memories. I remember only this. My mind and soul were sucked down into a black abyss where I had no volition or consciousness. It was another dimension of the mind where my senses were altered. Nothing existed there but the intense blackness beyond time and space. I could not see the other, nor conceive of it. It was pure intelligence, stripped of flesh. It was alive, and it had power that was godlike. There, in the great darkness, I stood alone, unaided, sensing the approach of an entity from some horribly remote place where all values were altered. I sensed La's nearness. "Hurry," her thought came to me, "before it wakens." Warmth flowed into me. The blackness receded. Against the farther wall something lay. A thing bafflingly human. A great-headed thing with a tiny pallid body coiled beneath it. It was squirming toward me. "Destroy it," La communicated. The pistol in my hand thundered, bucking against my palm. Echoes roared against the walls. I fired and fired again until the gun was empty. "It is dead," Lars' thought entered my mind. I stumbled, dropped the pistol. It was the child of an old super race, a child not yet born. Can you conceive of such a race, where even the unborn had power beyond human understanding? My mind wondered what the adult alien must be. I shivered, suddenly cold. An icy wind gusted through the temple. Lars' thought was clear in my mind. Now the valley is no longer a barrier to the elements. The other created fog and warmth to protect itself. Now it is dead, and your world reclaims its own. From the outer door of the temple, I could see the fog being driven away by a swift wind. Snow was falling slowly, great white flakes that blanketed the blue moss and lay like caps on the red shards that dotted the valley. I shall die swiftly and easily now, instead of slowly by starvation, Lars said. A moment later a thought crossed my mind, faint and intangible as a snowflake, and I knew Lars was saying goodbye. I left the valley. Once I looked back, but there was only a veil of snow behind me. And out of the greatest adventure the cosmic gods ever conceived, only this. For a little while, the eternal veil of time was ripped away, and the door to the unknown was held ajar. But now the door is closed once more. Below Huascan a robot guards a tomb. That is all. The snow fell faster. Shivering, I ploughed through the deepening drifts. My compass needle pointed north. The spell that had enthralled the valley was gone. Half an hour later I found the trail, and the road to safety lay open before me. Fra Raphael would be waiting to hear my story. But I did not think that he would believe it.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. The Walls by Keith Laumer, originally published in Amazing Stories, March 1963. Narrated by Tom Trussel. Harry Trimble looked pleased when he stepped into the apartment. The lift door had hardly clacked shut behind him on the peering commuter faces in the car before he had slipped his arm behind Flora's back, bumped his face against her cheek, and chuckled. "Well, what would you say to a little surprise? Something you've waited a long time for." Flora looked up from the dialer ration panel. "A surprise, Harry?" "I know how you feel about the apartment, Flora. Well, from now on, you won't be seeing so much of it." "Harry!" He winced at her clutch on his arm. Her face was pale under the day glare strip. "We're not moving to the country?" Harry pried his arm free. "The country? What the devil are you talking about?" He was frowning now, the pleased look gone. "You should use the lamps more," he said. "You look sick." He glanced around the apartment. The 4 perfectly flat rectangular walls, the glassy surface of the vari-glow ceiling, the floor with its pattern of sink-away panels. His eye fell on the 4-foot square of the TV screen. "I'm having that thing taken out tomorrow," he said. The pleased look was coming back. He cocked an eye at Flora. "And I'm having a full wall installed." Flora glanced at the blank screen. "A full wall, Harry?" "Yep." Harry smacked a fist into her palm, taking a turn up and down the room. "We'll be the first in our cell block to have a full wall." "Why, that would be nice, Harry." "Nice?" Harry punched the screen control, then deployed the 2 chairs with tray racks ready to receive the evening meal. Behind him, figures jiggled on the screen. "It's a darn sight more than nice," he said, raising his voice over the shrill and thump of the music. It's expensive, for one thing. Who else do you know that can afford? But nothing. Imagine it, Flora. It'll be like having a balcony seat, looking out on other people's lives. But we have so little space now. Won't it take up? Of course not. How do you manage to stay so ignorant of technical progress? It's only 1/8 of an inch thick. Think of it. That thick. Harry indicated 1/8 of an inch with his fingers. And better colour and detail than you've ever seen. It's all done with what they call an edge excitation effect. Harry, the old screen is good enough. Couldn't we use the money for a trip? How do you know if it's good enough? You never have it on. I have to turn it on myself when I get home. Flora brought the trays, and they ate silently, watching the screen. After dinner, Flora disposed of the trays, retracted the table and chairs, and extended the beds. They lay in the dark, not talking. It's a whole new system, Harry said suddenly. The full-wall people have their own programming scheme. They plan your whole day, wake you up at the right time with some lively music, give you breakfast menus to dial, then follow up with a good sitcom to get you into the day. Then there's nap music, with subliminal hypnotics if you have trouble sleeping. Then, Harry, can I turn it off if I want to? Turn it off? Harry sounded puzzled. The idea is to leave it on. That's why I'm having it installed for you, you know, so you can use it. But sometimes I'd like to just think. Think? Brood, you mean? He heaved a sigh. Look, Flora, I know this place isn't fancy. Sure, you get a little tired of being here all the time, but there are plenty of people worse off. And now, with full wall, you'll get a feeling of more space. Harry, Flora spoke rapidly, I wish we could go away. I mean, leave the city and get a little place where we can be alone, even if it means working hard, and where I can have a garden and maybe keep chickens, and you could chop firewood. Good God, Harry roared, cutting her off. Then, these fantasies of yours, he said quietly. You have to learn to live in the real world, Flora. Live in the woods. Wet leaves, wet bark, bugs, mould. Talk about depressing. There was a long silence. I know. You're right, Harry, Flora said. I'll enjoy the full wall. It was very sweet of you to think of getting it for me. Sure, Harry said. It'll be better. You'll see. The full wall was different, Flora agreed as soon as the serviceman had made the last adjustments and flipped it on. There was vivid colour, fine detail, and a remarkable sense of depth. The shows were about the same, fast-paced, bursting with variety and energy. It was exciting at first, having full-sized people talking, eating, fighting, taking baths, making love, right in the room with you. If you sat across the room and half closed your eyes, you could almost imagine you were watching real people. Of course, real people wouldn't carry on like that. But then it was hard to say what real people might do. Flora had always thought Doll Star wore padded brasseries, but when she stripped on full wall, there wasn't any fakery about it. Harry was pleased too when he arrived home to find the wall on. He and Flora would dial dinner with one eye on the screen, then slip into bed and view until the bulldoze pills they'd started taking took effect. Perhaps things were better, Flora thought hopefully. More like they used to be. But after a month or two, the full wall began to pall. The same faces, the same pratfalls, the same happy quizmasters, the puzzled prize winners, the delinquent youths and fumbling dads, the bosoms, all the same. On the 63rd day, Flora switched the full wall off. The light and sound died, leaving a faint, dwindling glow. She eyed the glassy wall uneasily, as one might view the coffin of an acquaintance. It was quiet in the apartment. Flora fussed with the dialer ration, averting her eyes from the dead screen. She turned to deploy the solitaire table, and started violently. The screen, the residual glow having faded now, was a perfect mirror. She went close to it, touched the hard surface with a finger. It was almost invisible. She studied her reflected face, the large dark eyes with shadows under them, the cheek line, a trifle too hollow now to be really chic, the hair drawn back in an uninspired bun. Behind her, the doubled room, unadorned now that all the furnishings were retracted into the floor except for the pictures on the wall. Photographs of the children away at school, a sunny scene of green pasture land, a painting of rolling waves at sea. She stepped back, considering the effect. The floor and walls seemed to continue without interruption, except for a hardly noticeable line. It was as though the apartment were twice as large, if only it weren't so empty. Flora deployed the table and chairs, dialed a lunch, and sat, eating, watching her double. No wonder Harry seemed indifferent lately, she thought, noting the rounded shoulders, the insignificant bust, the slack posture. She would have to do something in the way of self-improvement. Half an hour of the silent companionship of her image was enough. Flora snapped the screen back on, watched almost with relief as a grinning cowboy in velvet chaps made strumming motions while an intricately fingered guitar melody blared from the soundtrack. Thereafter, she turned the screen off every day, at first only for an hour, later for longer and longer periods. Once she found herself chatting gaily to her reflection, and hastily fell silent. It wasn't as though she were becoming neurotic, she assured herself. It was just the feeling of roominess that made her like the mirror screen. And she was always careful to have it on when Harry arrived home. It was about 6 months after the full wall had been installed that Harry emerged one day from the lift, smiling in a way that reminded Flora of that earlier evening. He dropped his briefcase into his floor locker, looked around the apartment, humming to himself. "What is it, Harry?" Flora asked. Harry glanced at her. "It's not a log cabin in the woods," he said, "but maybe you'll like it anyway." "What is it, dear?" "Don't sound so dubious." He broke into a broad smile. "I'm getting you another full wall." Flora looked puzzled. "But this one is working perfectly, Harry." "Of course it is," he snapped. "I mean you're getting another wall. You'll have 2. What about that? 2 full walls, and nobody else in the cell block has 1 yet. The only question is—" he rubbed his hands together, striding up and down the room, eyeing the walls. "Which wall is it to be? You can have it adjacent or opposite. I went over the whole thing with the full wall people today. By God, they're doing a magnificent job of programming. You see, the 2 walls will be synchronized. You're getting the same show on both. You're seeing it from 2 angles, just as though you were right there in the middle of it. The whole program has been built on that principle." "Harry, I'm not sure I want another wall." "Oh, nonsense! What is this, some kind of self-denial urge? Why not have the best, if you can afford it? And by God, I can afford it. I'm hitting my stride." "Harry, could I go with you some day? Tomorrow? I'd like to see where you work, meet your friends." "Flora, are you out of your mind? You've seen the commuter car. You know how crowded it is. And what will you do when you got there? Just stand around all day, blocking the aisle? Why don't you appreciate the luxury of having your own place, a little privacy, and now 2 full walls?" "Then could I go somewhere else I could take a later car? I want to get out in the open air, Harry. I haven't seen the sky for years, it seems." "But—" Harry groped for words, staring at Flora. "Why would you want to go up on the roof?" "Not the roof. I want to get out of the city, just for a little while. I'll be back home in time to dial your dinner." "Do you mean to tell me You want to spend all that money to wedge yourself in a verticar and then transfer to across town and travel maybe 70 miles, packed in like a sardine, standing up all the way, just so you can get out and stand in a wasteland and look back at the walls? And then get back in another car, if you're lucky, and come back again? No, I don't know. I just want to get out, Harry. The roof. Could I get to the roof? Harry came over to pat Flora awkwardly on the arm. Now, take it easy, Flora. You're a little tired and stale, I know. I get the same way sometimes, but don't get the idea that you're missing anything by not having to get into that rat race. Heaven knows I wish I could stay home, and this new wall is going to make things different. You'll see. The new full wall was installed adjacent to the first, with a joint so beautifully fitted that only the finest line marked the junction. As soon as she was alone with it, Flora switched it off. Now 2 reflections stared back at her from behind what appeared to be 2 intersecting planes of clear glass. She waved an arm. The 2 slave figures aped her. She walked toward the mirrored corner. They advanced. She stepped back. They retreated. She went to the far corner of the room and studied the effect. It wasn't as nice as before. Instead of a simple room, neatly bounded on all 4 sides by solid walls, she seemed now to occupy a stage set off by windows through which other similar stages were visible, endlessly repeated. The old feeling of intimate companionship with her reflected self was gone. The 2 mirror women were strangers, silently watching her. Defiantly, she stuck out her tongue. The 2 reflections grimaced menacingly. With a small cry, Flora ran to the switch, turned the screens on. They were seldom off after that. Sometimes, when the hammering of hooves became too wearying, or the shouting of comics too strident, she would blank them out and sit, back to the mirror walls, sipping a cup of hot cofflet and waiting. But they were always on when Harry arrived, sometimes glum, sometimes brisk and satisfied. He would settle himself in his chair, waiting patiently enough for dinner, watching the screens. "They're all right," he would declare, nodding. "Look at that, Flora. Look at the way that fellow whipped right across there. By golly, you've got to hand it to the full wall people." "Harry, where do they make the shows? The ones that show the beautiful scenery, the trees and rolling hills and mountains?" Harry was chewing. "Don't know," he said. "On location, I suppose." "Then there really are places like that. I mean, they aren't just making it up?" Harry stared at her, mouth full and half open. He grunted and resumed chewing. He swallowed. "I suppose that's another of your cracks." "I don't understand, Harry," Flora said. He took another bite, glanced sideways at her puzzled expression. "Of course they aren't making it up. How the devil could they make up a mountain?" "I'd like to see those places." "Here we go again," Harry said. "I was hoping I could enjoy a nice meal and then view a while, but I guess you're not going to allow that." Of course, Harry. I just said—" "I know what you said. Well, look at them then." He waved his hand at the screen. "There it is. The whole world. You can sit right here and view it all." "But I want to do more than just view it. I want to live it. I want to be in those places and feel leaves under my feet and have rain fall on my face." Harry frowned incredulously. "You mean you want to be an actress?" "No, of course not." "I don't know what you want. You have a home, 2 full walls, and this isn't all. I'm working towards something, Flora." Flora sighed. "Yes, Harry, I'm very lucky." "Darn right," Harry nodded emphatically, eyes on the screens. "Dial me another cofflet, will you?" The 3rd full wall came as a surprise. Flora had taken the 1100 car to the robo-clinic on the 478th level for her annual checkup. When she returned home, there it was. She hardly noticed the chorus of gasps cut off abruptly as the door shut in the faces of the other wives in the car. Flora stood, impressed in spite of herself by the fantastic panorama filling her apartment. Directly before her, the studio audience gaped up from the massed seats. A fat man in the front row reached inside a red plaid shirt to scratch. Flora could see the perspiration on his forehead. Farther back, a couple nuzzled, eyes on the stage. Who were they? Flora wondered. How did they manage to get out of their apartments and offices and sit in a real theatre? To the left, an owlish youth blinked from a brightly lit cage, and on the right, the MC caressed the mic, chattering. Flora deployed her chair, sank down, looking first this way, then that. There was so much going on, and she was in the middle of it. She watched for half an hour, then retracted the chair, deployed the bed. She was tired from the trip. A little nap. She stopped with the first zipper. The MC was staring directly at her, leering. The owlish youth blinked at her. The fat man scratched himself, staring up at her from the front row. She couldn't undress in front of all of them. She glanced around, located the switch near the door. With a click, the scene died around her. The glowing walls seemed to press close, fading slowly. Flora turned to the one remaining opaque wall, undressed slowly, her eyes on the familiar pictures. The children. She hadn't seen them since the last semi-annual vacation week. The cost of travel was so high, and the crowding. She turned to the bed, and the 3 mirror-bright walls confronted her. She stared at the pale figure before her, stark against the wall patched with its faded mementos. She took a step. On either side, an endless rank of gaunt, nude figures stepped in unison. She whirled, fixed her eyes gratefully on the familiar wall, the thin crevice outlining the door, the picture of the sea. She closed her eyes, groped her way to the bed. Once covered by the sheet, she opened her eyes. The beds stood in a row, all identical, each with its huddled figure like an infinite charity ward, she thought, or like a morgue where all the world lay dead. Harry munched his yeast chop, his head moving from side to side as he followed the action across the 3 walls. "It's marvellous, Flora, marvellous! But it can be better yet," he added mysteriously. "Harry, couldn't we move to a bigger place, and maybe do away with 2 other walls? Flora, you know better than that. I'm lucky to have gotten this apartment when I did. There's nothing, absolutely nothing available." He chuckled. "In a way, the situation is good job insurance. You know, I couldn't be fired, even if the company wanted to. They couldn't get a replacement. A man can't very well take a job if he hasn't a place to live in the city. And I can sit on this place as long as I like. We might get tired of issue rations, but by God, we could hold on. So not that anybody's in danger of getting fired." "We could move out of the city, Harry. When I was a girl—" "Oh, not again," Harry groaned. "I thought that was all threshed out long ago." He fixed a pained look on Flora. "Try to understand, Flora. The population of the world has doubled since you were a girl. Do you realize what that means? There are more people alive now than had been born in all previous human history up to 50 years ago. That farm you remember visiting as a kid, it's all paved now. There are tall buildings there. The highways you remember, full of private autos, all driving across open country, they're all gone. There aren't any highways or any open country except the TV settings and a few estates like the President's acre and a half. Not that any sun hits it, with all those buildings around it, and maybe some essential dryland farms for stuff they can't synthesize or get from the sea." "There has to be some place we can go. It wasn't meant that people should spend their lives like this, away from the sun, the sea." A shadow crossed Harry's face. "I can remember things too, Flora," he said softly. We spent a week at the beach once, when I was a small boy. I remember getting up at dawn with the sky all pink and purple and going down to the water's edge. There were little creatures in the sand, little wild things. I could see tiny fish darting along in a wave crest just before it broke. I could feel the sand with my toes. The gulls sailed around overhead, and there was even a tree. But it's gone now. There isn't any beach anywhere. That's all over. He broke off. Never mind. That was then. This is now. They've paved the beach and built processing plants on it, and they've paved the farms and the parks and the gardens, but they've given us full wall to make up for it, and... There was a buzz from the door. Harry got to his feet. "They're here, Flora. Wait till you see." Something seemed to tighten around Flora's throat as the men emerged from the lift, gingerly handling the great roll of wall screen. "Harry?" "4 walls," Harry said triumphantly. "I told you I was working towards something, remember? Well, this is it. By God, the Harry Trimbles have shown them." "Harry, I can't. Not 4 walls." "I know you're a little overwhelmed, but you deserve it, Flora." "Harry, I don't want 4 walls. I can't stand it. It will be all around me." Harry stepped to her side, gripped her wrist fiercely. "Shut up," he hissed. "Do you want the workmen to think you're out of your mind?" He grinned at the men. "How about a cofflet, boys?" "You kidding?" one inquired. The other went silently about the work of rolling out the panel, attaching contact strips. Another reached for the sea scene. "No!" Flora threw herself against the wall, as though to cover the pictures with her body. "You can't take my pictures! Harry, don't let them!" "Look, sister, I don't want your crummy pictures." "Flora, get hold of yourself. Here, I'll help you put the pictures in your floor locker." "Bunch of nuts," one of the men muttered. "Here, keep a civil tongue in your head," Harry started. The man who had spoken stepped up to him. He was taller than Harry and solidly built. "Any more crap out of you, and I'll break you in half. You and the old bag, shut up and keep out of my way. I got a job to do." Harry sat beside Flora, his face white with fury. "You and your vapourings," he hissed. "So I have to endure this. I have a good mind to—" He trailed off. The men finished and left with all 4 walls blaring. "Harry," Flora's voice shook, "how will you get out? They've put it right across the door. They've sealed us in." "Don't be a bigger idiot than you have to." Harry's voice was ugly over the thunder from the screens. He went to the newly covered wall, groped, found the tiny pin switch. At a touch, it slid aside as always, revealing the blank face of the lift shaft safety door. A moment later, it too slid aside, and Harry forced his way into the car. Flora caught a glimpse of his flushed, angry face as the door closed. Around her, the walls roared. A saloon fight was in full swing. She ducked as a chair sailed toward her, whirled to see it smash down a man behind her. Shots rang out. Men ran this way and that. The noise was deafening. That man, Flora thought, the vicious one. He had set it too loud, purposely. The scene shifted. Horses galloped across the room. Dust clouds rose, nearly choking her in the verisimilitude of the illusion. It was as though she crouched under a small square canopy of ceiling in the middle of the immense plain. Now there were cattle, wild-eyed, with tossing horns, bellowing, thundering in an unbroken sea across the screens, charging at Flora out of the wall, pouring past her on left and right. She screamed, shut her eyes, and ran blindly to the wall, groping for the switch. The uproar subsided. Flora gasped in relief, her head humming. She felt faint, dizzy. She had to lie down. Everything was going black around her. The glowing walls swirled, fading. Flora sank to the floor. Later. Perhaps a few minutes, maybe hours. She had no way of knowing. Flora sat up. She looked out across an infinite vista of tile floor, which swept away to the distant horizon in all directions as far as the eye could see, and over all that vast plain, Hollow-eyed women crouched at intervals of 15 feet in endless numbers, waiting. Flora stared into the eyes of the nearest reflection. It stared back, a stranger. She moved her head quickly to try and catch a glimpse of the next woman, but no matter how fast she moved, the nearer woman anticipated her, interposing her face between Flora and all the others. Flora turned. A cold-eyed woman guarded this rank too. "Please," Flora heard herself pleading. "Please, please." She bit her lip, eyes shut. She had to get hold of herself. These were only mirrors. She knew that. Only mirrors. The other women, they were mere reflections, even the hostile ones who hid the others. They were herself, mirrored in the walls. She opened her eyes. She knew there were joints in the glassy wall. All she had to do was find them, and the illusion of the endless plain would collapse. There, that thin black line, like a wire stretched from floor to ceiling, that was a corner of the room. She was not lost in an infinitude of weeping women on a vast plain. She was right there, in her own apartment, alone. She turned, finding the other corners. They were all there, all visible. She knew what they were. But why did they continue to look like wires, setting apart the squares of floor, each with its silent, grieving occupant? She closed her eyes again, fighting down the panic. She would tell Harry. As soon as he came home, it was only a few hours, she would explain it to him. "I'm sick, Harry. You have to send me away to some place where I'll lie in a real bed, with sheets and blankets, beside an open window, looking out across fields and forests. Someone kind, will bring me a tray, with a bowl of soup, real soup, made from real chickens, and with real bread, and even a glass of milk, and a napkin made of real cloth." She should find her bed, and deploy it, and rest there until Harry came, but she was so tired. It was better to wait here, just relaxing, not thinking about the immense floor and the other women who waited with her. She slept. When she awoke, she sat up, confused. There had been a dream. But how strange! The walls of the cell block were transparent now. She could see all the other apartments, stretching away to every side. She nodded. It was as she thought. They were all as barren and featureless as her own. And Harry was wrong. They all had 4 full walls, and the other women, the other wives, shut up like her in these small, mean cells, they were all aging and sick and faded, starved for fresh air and sunshine. She nodded again, and the woman in the next apartment nodded in sympathy. All the women were nodding. They all agreed. Poor things. When Harry came, she would show him how it was. He would see that the full walls weren't enough. They all had them, and they were all unhappy. When Harry came, it was time now. She knew it. After so many years, you didn't need a watch to tell when Harry was due. She had better get up, make herself presentable. She rose unsteadily to her feet. The other husbands were coming too, Flora noted. All the wives were getting ready. They moved about, opening their floor lockers, patting at their hair, slipping into another dress. Flora went to the dial ration, and all around, in all the apartments, the wives deployed the tables and dialed the dinners. She tried to see what the woman next door was dialing, but it was too far. She laughed at the way her neighbour craned to see what she was preparing. The other woman laughed too. She was a good sport. "Kelpies," Flora called cheerily, "and mock spam and cofflet." Dinner was ready now. Flora turned to the door wall and waited. Harry would be so pleased at not having to wait. Then, after dinner, she'd explain about her illness. Was it the right wall she was waiting before? The line around the door was so fine you couldn't really see it. She laughed at how funny it would be if Harry came in and found her standing, staring at the wrong wall. She turned, and saw a movement on her left in the next apartment. Flora watched as the door opened. A man stepped in. The next-door woman went forward to meet him. To meet Harry. It was Harry! Flora whirled. Her four walls stood blank and glassy, while all around her the other wives greeted Harry, seated him at their tables, and offered him cofflet. "Harry!" she screamed, throwing herself at the wall. It threw her back. She ran to the next wall, hammering, screaming, "Harry! Harry!" In all the other apartments, Harry chewed, nodded, smiled. The other wives pawed, fussed over Harry, nibbled daintily, and none of them, not one of them, paid the slightest attention to her. She stood in the centre of the room, not screaming now, only sobbing silently. In the four glass walls that enclosed her, she stood alone. There was no point in calling any longer. No matter how she screamed, how she beat against the walls, or how she called for Harry, she knew that no one would ever hear.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Cottage by Frank Belknap Long. Originally published in Fantastic Universe, September 1954. Narrated by Tom Trussel. To Will Durkin, it seemed to be the realization of a long-cherished dream. This return from town over a rutted dirt road, equipped and ready for a cruel duel with another man's offspring. He raised his left hand as he drove, staring at his bony knuckles, and then slashing at the empty air with a whiplash ferocity of purpose. Perhaps there had been a hard core of cruelty in Durkin at birth. Perhaps he had knotted up his fists and cried out in resentment on first seeing the sunlight, eager to hurt and punish. It was difficult to say, difficult to be sure. But certainly the stony soil which had nourished his childhood had helped to make him what he was, a gaunt, restless-eyed man so consumed by animosity he could find no pleasure in merriment of any kind. In town he had stalked with fierce impatience from the general store to the post office, and then back down Cedar Street to his car, clutching his purchase with the greediness of a carrion crow eager to take flight. Now, beneath the leaden sky, in his asthmatic wreck of an automobile, he pictured himself as too shrewd and quick-witted to allow a woman's simpering stupidity to weaken his attachment to the land. A dust storm could stir a man to anger and rob him of a night's sleep. It could demolish his chicken cots and embitter him in other ways. But it could also protect him by keeping him hard. So certain was he of that hardness that the gathering clouds, the dust flurries, and the whistling wind gave him no concern. They seemed to be setting a seal on his purpose, and he was sure that if trouble descended from the sky, he would know how to cope with it. Unfortunately, Durkin had no way of knowing that the desert was soon to blossom in ways that were strange. He heard the dull, occasional rumbling, and saw the sky light up far to the east. But his thoughts were on other things. If he had been told that the desert was being used by the government as an atomic proving ground, he would have dismissed the matter with a shrug. Malice narrows curiosity. In the back seat of the creaking car, a small white cottage caught and held the leaden sky glow, its tiny windows gleaming like uncut jewels. A man of wide and kindly sympathies would have taken delight in the cottage, for though it was a cheap toy, it had been built with great respect for the critical eye of childhood. It had 8 rooms, a porch trellis, and a little golden weathercock on its roof. Durkin smiled spitefully, remembering with grim pleasure the child training article in the popular science magazine which had sent him into town in search of an inexpensive dollhouse. The article had contained a great deal of meat, and its impact upon his mind had been remarkably direct. Give a kid a dollhouse with a mother and father doll inside, and you could find out exactly what he thought of his parents. He'd move the dolls around and work out his private grudges on them. He'd pretend the dolls were his real parents and act out what the article had called the family drama. Yeah, why not? A man had a right to know what his own kids thought of him, hadn't he? Especially if they were stepkids and owed everything to him. Apart from the fact that the article had been against punishing children the way he'd been punished as a kid, and what better way was there? Its ideas were good. The article had contained a lot of fancy phrases like harmful emotional repression and healthful release of guilt feelings, but giving a grudge a fancy name didn't change it one bit. If the kids he'd fed and clothed hated him, his hand would come down heavy on them. Yes, by heaven, each whack would ring out like a pistol shot. It was high noon when Durkin came in sight of the farmhouse, and saw the children playing in the yard and his wife standing in the kitchen door. Her stringy black hair annoyed him far out of proportion to its importance, and he was further incensed by the realization that she was staring up the road as if she had another complaint to make, and could hardly wait for him to come within earshot. He drove into the yard, muttering unpleasantly to himself. Abruptly, his stepson Robert, a tall, freckled-faced youngster of 9, stopped playing. 7-year-old Emily, thoughtful-eyed and less assertive, remained seated, but Durkin could see that there was a defiant something struggling in her head. The ritual of mistrust they'd worked out against him never varied. As he descended from the car, he became aware of a hostile silence hemming him in, making him feel like a stranger. Even their expressions betrayed them. The instant fear came into Robert's eyes. Emily, too, became fearful, clutching the doll she was holding more tightly to her breast. Flushed and resentful, Durkin stood waiting for his wife to advance toward him across the yard. She had been beautiful once, but she now only reminded him of a nag set out to pasture after years of usefulness about the farm. She was as handy about the farm as she was about a stove, but that didn't mean he had to be grateful to her. He'd taken her in and married her, hadn't he? A woman of 40 with 2 kids, a complaining woman who was always trying to meddle in his affairs. "You're back early, Will," Helen Durkin said. "Yeah," he grunted, eyeing her bitterly. "Did you buy the fertilizer and the barbed wire?" He shook his head, his lips writhing back from his teeth in cruel derision. "I bought something better," he said. His voice was harsh, edged with mockery. "A present for the kids." Durkin reached into the car as he spoke and hauled out the dollhouse. He set it down on the stony soil directly in front of him and folded his arms, his eyes darting toward his stepson in surly challenge. "Come here, Robbie," he called out. "Look what I've got for you." Robert scrambled to his feet with a startled gasp, and Emily turned to look at her mother in bewilderment. Durkin glanced triumphantly at his wife, stepped back, and waited for the children to approach. Robert came forward slowly, stark incredulity in his stare. His sister followed at a less cautious pace, her fear swallowed up by the miracle that had taken place before her very eyes. Robert spoke first. "Golly, it's a little house." "A dollhouse," Emily elaborated, falling to her knees and staring in through the diamond-bright windows at a sight that made her catch her breath. In a room on the ground floor, 4 dolls sat at a circular table. Before each was a knife and fork, a tiny plate, and a double serving of wax vegetables. The husband doll wore a stiff, ill-fitting store suit, the wife a checkered gingham dress, and the 2 children blue denim overalls. The parents were wooden dolls, but Durkin had been forced to purchase the children separately and insert them in the house. The children were made of some new-fangled plastic material which Durkin intensely disliked. But very lifelike dolls they were, and just the right size to lend wings to the illusion of a happy family about to break bread together. "That's me!" Emily cried excitedly. She raised a window, reached inside, and lifted herself out. The doll had dark hair and brown eyes, and Emily was an ash blonde. But childhood is not a time for carping, and it had been well established that a completely unspoiled imagination can be sent soaring by a fancied resemblance in the twinkling of an eye. "That's me, isn't it, Mummy?" Emily insisted. "Isn't it?" She displayed the doll proudly to her mother, her eyes shining with unshakable conviction. "Yes, dear, of course." Helen Durkin glanced sharply at her husband as she spoke. The look in his eyes frightened her. There was satisfaction in his stare, but it was a cold, derisive kind of satisfaction with no warmth or sympathy radiating out from it. He was watching Emily as he might have watched a hummingbird hovering over a cannibal plant, one of those horrible fly-trap things that grew in tropical jungles. What chance would the hummingbird have against the sudden cruel closing of the plant's spiked petals, its animal-like ferocity of purpose? An overpowering surge of terror swept over Durkin's wife, tightening the muscles of her throat. "Will, don't!" she wanted to scream. "Don't punish the children because you hate me, or because you hate yourself. Don't, Will, please." Robert failed to notice the trembling of his mother's hands, failed even to observe that his stepfather had not budged an inch from his attitude of sharp-eyed observation. For a moment the adult world was blotted out for Robert, blotted out completely. He knelt and stared through the cottage window as his sister had done, resting his hand on the arching trellis. It was not a doll-house to Robert. He took far too much pride in his budding masculinity to admit for an instant that he could be interested in a doll-house. No, it was a cottage, small, white, and very beautiful. He pictured himself as having a wife and children of his own, and coming home every night to just such a cottage. "You look tired," his wife would say. "You'd better rest a bit, then we'll have dinner." He could picture himself going into the bathroom and turning on the hot water. Later he'd open the windows wide to the night air. He'd hear crickets chirping as the children clustered about him. But so complex and subtle are childhood identifications that he could also think of himself as still a boy, living with his sister in a cottage just as small, white, and beautiful, but set adrift on a pirate-perilous sea remote from his stepfather's mockery. With a swift, defiant gesture, Robert reached in through the window and grasped the crude doll replica of himself. He lifted it out, jarring the parent dolls slightly. "Excuse me, Mum," he said. To the replica of his stepfather he offered no apology. Durkin's lips whitened, and for the barest instant a defeated look touched his gaunt face. From thought to attitude he had the whip-hand over his stepchildren. Even when his power could not be questioned, he found himself a shunned and forgotten man. Fury turned the living flesh and bone of his face into a stone mask with features so sharp that his wife recoiled as if feeling the cruel rasp and bite of them against her cheeks. Cursing softly, Durkin swung about and went striding toward the kitchen door without a backward glance. All through dinner he was silent, completely ignoring his wife, and raising his eyes only to stare out the kitchen window at the bare yellow earth he could at least bend to his will. Even when the children excused themselves and ran out into the yard again, he remained sullenly uncommunicative. In an attempt to make conversation, Helen Durkin said, "Will, it came over the radio right after you left. They're making some more of those atomic weapon tests. Remember the last time? How the explosion shook the house?" "So that's where the flash came from," Durkin muttered. "I saw it when I stopped at the gas station to get my battery checked. I figured it was just heat lightning."
"Robbie saw it too," Robert's mother said. "It means a lot to a boy to know he's living in an age like this. In some ways, Robbie is a man already, Will. A boy born 100 years ago had to remain a child every waking hour, but not Robbie. Robbie was born into a different kind of world."
Her eyes flashed with stubborn pride.
"Robbie has real strength inside of him, Will. He'll make a mark for himself in the world. He'll grow up knowing what atomic energy means. He won't age and dry up before his time. You ought to be proud of him, Will."
Abruptly, Durkin pushed back his chair and stood up, his eyes grown sharp again from watching the children playing in the yard. He had avoided looking at his wife, but now he permitted his gaze to linger for an instant on her pinched and sallow features, in a scrutiny so mocking it made her almost physically ill. "Your brats hate me," his eyes mocked. "One of these days I'll catch them off guard and give them a lesson in discipline they won't forget in a hurry." She knew what he was waiting for. He was hoping they'd stop playing just long enough to cast a look toward the kitchen door filled with unmistakable hate. He was hoping to emerge beneath the darkening sky and see Emily turn away her head, remembering the loving father she had lost and the harsh, unbending man who had come to take his place. She knew that he was waiting only for that. He was the kind of man who had to have an excuse to justify his every act of cruelty. Some oddity in his make-up made self-justification as necessary to him as breathing. With a chill foreboding, she watched him turn and go striding out into the yard. The children had been kneeling on opposite sides of the dollhouse, but they got up the instant they saw their stepfather approaching. Robert looked guilty, and his sister's face mirrored his guilt. "You ate your lunch mighty fast," Durkin said. "What's going on here?"
"Nothing," Robert said.
"What kind of answer is that?" Durkin demanded, his face turning ugly.
"We were just playing house," Emily said quickly.
"Then why did you get up so fast when you saw me?" Durkin asked. "Is there something in that house you don't want me to see?" Robert shook his head, his eyes on the ground. "Speak up. I asked you a question."
"We were just pretending," Robert said.
For an instant, the man and the two children stood with the dollhouse between them. They were each aware that they had started a game that must be played out now to the bitter end, no matter how frightening it became. "We'll soon know," Durkin said. Durkin bent swiftly, and without glancing at the children, picked up the house and raised it until the ground floor windows were on a level with his eyes. He stared in. Children do not self-consciously engage in gruesome pranks, even when they hate. Emotional impulses, which later in life are filtered through reason and become social attitudes, remain in children appallingly direct. Children are thus exposed to adult censure for acts which they would never dream of performing in a frame of reference removed from the playground and tied in with their socially consolidated attitudes of respect toward home, school, and parents. Children chalk up sidewalks, ring doorbells, and throw stones at windows and are almost instantly sorry. Durkin knew nothing of that. He only saw himself sitting on a red-hot stove, his long legs drawn up grasshopper fashion on both sides of his lank body. What was even more shocking, He saw himself as a fiend incarnate. The children had done an astonishingly ingenious job of making a devil out of him by painting him in the darkest colours imaginable. In fact, they had painted him black. The ill-fitting store suit had been removed, and with the aid of Emily's watercolour set and Robert's clay modelling set, he had been made to resemble a demon being roasted over a spit. Utterly fiendish was his charcoal-dark aspect of face and limb. Horns sprouted from his temples, and a long forked tail, ash-grey in hue, coiled down over the stove like some evil brand snatched from the burning. There were tiny gleaming coals in the stove, fashioned of red isinglass. The stove had gone with the house, but by the matchless artistry of childhood something new had been added, and as Durkin stared, all of the colour drained from his face. He was sitting directly over the coals, exposed to the cruelly searing blast in every part of his anatomy. For an instant, the illusion of searing heat was so real that he responded psychosomatically. His nostrils dilated with the odour of burning flesh, and his nerve roots shrieked as if irradiated by intolerable pain. Then reality came sweeping back. Instead of an imaginary projection of himself, he saw only a ridiculous wooden doll sprawled akimbo on a toy stove. Shaking with rage, Durkin set the house down, swung about, and gripped his stepson savagely by the wrist. "Just pretending, were you?" he muttered. "Just waiting for me to come out here and pat you on the back?" Robert tried to break free. Sick with fear, he tugged and twisted, but Durkin had stronger fingers than a demon, and a deeper understanding of how a frightened boy could make a fool of a man by using his smallness as a cloak. "You too, Emily," Durkin said. "Come here. I want to have a long fatherly talk with you." Emily turned and cast a frantic glance of appeal toward the kitchen door. When her mother did not appear, she started backing away from her stepfather across the yard. Without releasing her brother, Durkin circled around in back of her. "Not so fast, brat," he warned. "You and Robbie play house in a mighty interesting way. Suppose you tell me more about it."
"Let me go," Robert pleaded. "We just took one of the dolls and made a Halloween coal man out of him."
"A coal man, eh?" Durkin sneered. "That's sure odd. You must have forgotten it's not Halloween."
"It doesn't have to be Halloween," Robert protested.
"Doesn't it? I suppose not. You could turn on your own father just as well on Thanksgiving Day. That's how grateful you are."
Emily spoke up defiantly then.
"You're not Robbie's father," she said. "You never could be."
"I tried my best to be a good father to Robbie," Durkin said, lowering his voice in mock humility. "You can't claim I didn't try. But there comes a time when discipline's needed. No punishment's severe enough for a boy who'd like to see his own father roasted like a chestnut in a red-hot fire." A sudden terrible anger fled in his eyes. "No punishment's bad enough, but a strong birch switch laid on heavy may do some good." He stared at Emily, his neck arched in chicken-hawk fashion. "I can't punish you the way I'm going to punish Robbie," he said. "You're too young, just a baby. But when a baby does wrong, you've got to be stern. That's kindness." Durkin bent abruptly, gripped his stepdaughter by the elbow, and lifted her to her feet. "A few hours without your supper in the dark."
"Mummy!" Emily shrieked. "Mummy! Mummy!"
The kitchen door flew open, and Helen Durkin came running out of the house, her eyes wide with fright. She went up to her husband and started tugging at his wrists.
"Let them go!" she cried. "Robbie hasn't done anything. I was watching every minute."
"He hasn't, eh?" Durkin glared at her. "He'd like to see me hanging from a rafter. Give him a piece of rope and he'd hang me in effigy."
"He wouldn't. Why do you say a thing like that? You must be out of your mind, Will Durkin."
"He would, I tell you. He's already done something just as bad. He's got to learn respect, and I'm going to give him the thrashing of his life."
"Will Durkin, you let them go. Do you hear? You've no right."
Surprisingly, Durkin complied. He released both children, and turned his full fury on his wife. "I'm going upstairs and get a birch switch," he said. "You'd better see that Robbie stays right here in the yard. I'll hold you responsible. If he isn't here when I come back, you can pack your things and get out. No right to punish my own son. We'll see." His eyes narrowed in relentless hate. Durkin swung about and went striding toward the house. Despite his rage, he experienced a fierce secret gratification in knowing he'd had the foresight to cut and trim a stout birch switch well in advance. Perhaps it was intended by something in the mysterious hidden texture of nature itself that Will Durkin should reach the house before the first blast came. Perhaps fury kindled and unleashed by a puny man in a moment of cataclysmic upheaval had an energy pattern of its own, capable of blending with that greater violence and carrying its victim to disaster, precisely as a tiny squirming creature of the sea might be lifted up and carried on the back of a terrified tortoise. Be that as it may, Durkin was well inside the house, crossing the kitchen to the living room, when light flashed all about him, and a chill wind brushed the nape of his neck. His lips tightened, but for an instant he continued on, as if refusing to believe that a mere rumbling and quaking could prevent him from climbing a narrow flight of stairs, and returning to the yard with a cruel instrument of retribution in his clasp. Then, abruptly, panic overcame him. Shock after shock shook the house, jarring up through him, threatening to pitch him off his feet. But even as he swung about in wild terror, he could not quite relinquish what he had set out to do. One part of his mind remained filled with choking rage, and his hands were busy at his waist, unbuckling his cowhide belt and ripping it free. At least he'd give his stepson a hiding. Suddenly, through the kitchen door, he caught a brief glimpse of the children, standing in the yard. They were clinging to their mother, but they were as yet untouched by the violence which was raging all about them. Durkin's jaw fell open. The violence increased with appalling suddenness, breaking every window in the house, filling the kitchen with blowing dust. With a deafening roar, the house vanished, carrying Durkin with it. The children cried out in bewilderment and fright, and pressed closer to their mother. In every upheaval, no matter how violent, there may well be pockets of erratically channeled calm, regions of security which remain untouched by the turbulence surrounding them. Helen Durkin clung resolutely to an assurance which nothing could shake, and with her conviction that the children would not be harmed, went a warm gratefulness that they had turned to her for comfort and protection. She stood staring straight ahead, refusing to be dismayed, hearing only a dreadful humming sound which gradually died away. Where the house had stood, there spread only a smooth expanse of yellow sand. The whirling was like nothing Durkin had ever known before. It constricted his chest, blurred his vision, and drove the blood in torrents from his heart. There was no stopping it, and as it grew steadily more intolerable, he tore at his collar, swayed, and went down on his hands and knees. Around and around the cottage whirled, now rising and tilting, and then descending with a terrible, jerky abruptness. Twice he tried to rise, but fell back helpless, powerless to save himself from the spineless inertia that sent him spinning to and fro like some ill-made, rain-sodden scarecrow dragged in disgust from a cornfield and tossed into a butter-churning machine. In one respect only was Durkin fortunate. His torment, though great and almost unendurable, was not absolutely continuous. There were moments when the cottage seemed to hover motionless in mid-air, or to drift lazily in a single direction with a buoyancy as light as thistledown. Gradually these moments became more frequent, calming Durkin like a soothing palm pressed with compassion to his brow. More and more frequent, until the merciless buffetings and swift, sickening descents ceased completely, and a light that was bright, clear, and steady streamed in through the kitchen window, and somewhere off in the distance a snowy-crested bird burst into song. There were flowers outside the window, scarlet and aquamarine faintly flecked with gold. Tall-stemmed and wide-petalled they were, almost screening the view, and if at that moment Durkin had been on his feet staring out, he might well have failed to see the huge, joyously romping lad. But Durkin was still lying prone, and the lad's curiosity had not yet been acutely aroused. The lad came swinging boisterously down a country lane, his lips puffed out in a childish pout, his chubby hands thrust deeply into the green and vermilion trousers of his play-suit. He did not love his foster-father, and he had run away in a sudden burst of independence, and was temporarily free to roam. Oh, it was good to be free to laugh and romp in the sunlight, and to build mud castles out of the gleaming red walls of snurkle nests. He came swinging around a curve in the lane, and stopped abruptly, staring straight before him in utter disbelief. For a moment he stood, as if turned to stone, his eyes saucer-wide in the slanting sun glow. Then he was running forward with a cry of boyish eagerness. The little cottage stood in a glimmer of sunlight and shadow cast by weaving boughs. All about it stretched a smooth blue lawn, starred with long-stemmed windflowers, as tall as the house itself. He clapped his hands in pure delight. True, he had a village of his own to play with, an entire toy village bright with weaving communication beams, but all the dolls were child dolls, and the village no longer pleased him. He pouted and became angry again when he thought about it. His foster-father did not want him to play with grown-up dolls. His foster-father was an old meanie, and he didn't want him to have any fun. He was hovering directly over the house now, straddling it. He reached down with a chuckle of delight, and poked at the little red chimney with a stubby forefinger, beaming in simple pleasure as 4 tiny bricks tumbled out on the roof. Then he bent over and stared with a puzzled frown at the smashed windows. A moment later he was squatting before the house, peeking in. Slowly as he stared, all of the good-natured anticipation went out of his face. Exaltation of a different kind came into his features, a fiendish kind of exaltation common enough in childhood, but often disturbing to adults. It was shockingly disturbing to Durkin. Roused suddenly to consciousness in the middle of the kitchen floor, he saw the great malicious child face staring in at him, and struggled frantically to rise, his eyes wild with terror. There were other things Durkin did not understand, about energy, about time, about other worlds of life and purpose lying parallel to ours in undreamed-of dimensions of space. He did know that a single farmhouse in the path of a tornado could be uprooted and carried for miles through the sky. He knew that a fence could be levelled, a tree torn down, and the rest of the countryside remain unscathed, even to this last sun-gilded haystack. It was easy to understand how such things might be, but nothing had prepared Durkin's mind for the disturbing and frightening parallel which a scientist might have drawn from a hurricane's erratic course. He had no way of knowing that matter on the fringe of an atomic blast could be agitated abnormally and pass into another dimension piecemeal. He had no way of knowing that the desert at the edge of an atomic proving ground might decide suddenly to blossom like some multi-dimensional rose. He had no way of knowing that size is a relative thing, varying with every matter-dissolving energy shift in the physical universe, and that a house could be huge in one dimension, his own, and tiny in another, and might even indeed take on the aspect of a house built solely to delight the eye of childhood. He had no way of knowing, for he had not heard the great eternal voices discussing it. The reddening of the rose meant nothing to him, the stars in their wheeling courses, the speculations of men like gods. All time, all space is relative, Einstein had said. There is only one equation for energy, matter, light, fire, air. And who knows how closely other dimensions may parallel ours? Durkin had no way of knowing until the great dimpled hand reached in through the window and picked him up. Then, and only then, in one blinding flash of intuition, he guessed the truth. Too late. The blade of grass was like a tendril rope, and it went so swiftly about Durkin's throat he had no time to leap back. As he screamed and struggled, a huge wet palm smothered his mouth, rumpled his hair, and squeezed the breath from his lungs. His struggles were of no avail. Emotional impulses, which later in life are filtered through reason and harden into social attitudes, remain in children appallingly fluid and direct. A child identifies itself with its toys, and it's very easy for a child to see a living, breathing adult human being in a doll, which is in reality quite unlike the object of its love or hate. Kneeling beside the house, a child Durkin knew nothing about thought it all out for the barest instant, its body oddly bent. Then it leaned forward and hung its hated foster-father very carefully to a ceiling rafter in the precise middle of the house. Ever so slowly the child arose, and the snowy-crested bird burst into song again, somewhere off in the distance. But Durkin knew nothing of that.
The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now, for the next story. The Belt by Wallace West. Originally published in Science Fiction Quarterly, November 1951. Narrated by Tom Trussel. No one foresaw what would come of the social experiment Jonathan Robertson started early in the 18th century on this little island. And Jonathan the Seventh found the terrible fruit of what had been sown. "Rum port to come home to, if I may say so, sir." The captain spat over the rail into the blue waters. Rum? Jonathan Robertson, 7th, continued to study the cliffs which he had not seen for 20 years. "Why?" "Oh, I dunno. Gives me the jumps every time I touch here. Maybe it's the name. New Patmos." "Yes, St. John did have a rough time when he was exiled on the original Isle of Patmos, didn't he? And then there's that gang on the dock. It's just old Tom and some of my father's workmen." "I know." The captain relit his pipe. "But any other Caribbean port I stop at, the dock workers are singing and skylarking. Those fellows never say a word. Rum, I call it. Some of my crew think they're jumbies. Won't set foot on shore here." "Jumbies are one thing I can assure you they're not, Captain," Jonathan chuckled. "They're just plain workmen, and English to boot. As for the old Tom, he carried me on his shoulders when I was a kid." "Cheerio, Tom," he continued, after the lines had been made fast and the ebony-coloured ancient was clambering over the rail. "Where's father?" "I'm sorry, sir," the answer came in the clipped British accent of the West Indies. "Your father is dead, sir, these 2 weeks." "Dead?" A picture of the 6th Jonathan Robertson, austere in his white linens, flashed through Jonathan's mind. It seemed impossible that he was no longer striding on his daily rounds to the factory and mine. "Yes, sir. Perhaps we'd better go up to the house at once, sir, if you don't mind. I'll tell the men to follow with the cargo." Tom turned to the leaden-faced, overall-clad trio on the pier and shouted, "Men, take cargo to storehouse. Bill, ye ken?" "Ya,"
grunted the man on the left. "Fred, ye ken? Cargo to storehouse." "Ya." The tone was identical. "Dick, ye ken?" "Ya." Tom picked up Jonathan's bags and led the way up a rocky path which eventually rounded a cliff which had hidden the Robertson mansion. It was a pleasant enough place, although sadly in need of paint. A grove of palm trees half concealed the ravages which time had made on its tall pillars. The house had an atmosphere of peace and quiet, but the effect was spoiled by an ugly factory which clung to the cliffside on the other side of the valley. Although it was Sunday, Jonathan noticed that smoke was belching from the factory chimney. "I know it's ungodly, this working on the Sabbath, sir," said Tom as his new master stared, "but they will work all the time, even during the funeral." He broke off and hobbled forward to swing the door of the mansion open. Everything was orderly inside. Lattices were drawn to keep out the equatorial sun. Teakwood floors gleamed. Dozens of canaries twittered in their cages near the windows. "This way, sir." Jonathan climbed a winding staircase which seemed smaller than they remembered it, and was ushered into the master bedroom. This was a cool, high-ceilinged chamber with many long windows looking out across the valley toward the crouching factory. "Your father wished you to stay here, sir. He said it would give you the feel of the place. On the desk there, you'll find the letter he was writing to you just before he died." "Thank you, Tom. That will be all for the present." Jonathan picked up the envelope and ripped it open. "My beloved son," the words were penned in a Spencerian script which wavered ever so slightly, "I should have told you years ago all the things which you will find written here, but I was afraid you would never return to take up the task which is now slipping through my fingers. You were too young when you left here to understand the strangeness of this place. Suffice to say, it killed your mother, and is now killing me. It has a curse, placed on our line by Sir Jonathan Robertson. Now it is time for you to face that curse." To start at the beginning, Sir Jonathan purchased this island from the Crown in 1709. He had discovered a vein of lapis lazuli here, which was to make him and his descendants immensely wealthy. God pity them all. The stone had to be worked just after it was taken from the mine, and before it hardened by contact with the air. So Sir Jonathan conceived the idea of a colony and a factory right on the island. He had served Queen Anne well, both as warrior and explorer, so he petitioned to purchase convicts from English prisons to work the mine and factory for him. That was a legitimate practice in those times. He received a shipment of some 200 prisoners of both sexes, ranging from debtors to murderers, and set them to work under an iron-fisted supervisor named Jock Macpherson. At first, Macpherson and the criminals fought each other bitterly, but the supervisor gave them better food than most had received in their lives, kept them working hard under heavy guard from dawn to dusk, and did not hesitate to crop the ears and even the noses of incipient rebels. Within a few years, they were behaving quite well. Glancing up as he turned a page, Jonathan found that old Tom was standing behind him, reading over his shoulder. "I said that would be all," he repeated firmly. "Yes, sir." The man hobbled out of the room, closing the door softly behind him. Sir Jonathan seems to have been one of the first men to discover the meaning of efficiency and the value of division of labour. I have often read the journal in which he described the manner in which he made the prisoners work. Each man had a certain amount of labour of a special kind to perform. That is, one would blast the ore, another would bring it to the surface, a third would split the stone into workable pieces, a fourth would chip it into rough shape, and so on. Each did his own job, and nothing else. Thus, each man and woman had a very definite and very circumscribed set of duties to perform each and every day. After 12 or 14 hours of this, you can imagine that they had little time or energy to think of revolt. Instead, they went to their mews and slept like animals. Late in life, Sir Jonathan had a son whom he sent to Paris to be educated, since he had amassed a considerable fortune by this time. In France, Jonathan II made the acquaintance of young Jean-Baptiste Pierre-Antoine de Monet de Lamarck, and became fired with the latter's still nebulous ideas about the effect of environment upon heredity. The second Jonathan rushed back to New Patmos and started experimenting along lines suggested by Lamarck's theories. He set about arranging the marriages of his workers and managing practically every moment of their daily lives. Again, there was some trouble, but the aging Jock Macpherson put it down. The details are bloody, but they do not matter at this late date. Sir Jonathan's grandson was able to dispense with guards. By this time, the descendants of the original prisoners had lost all initiative. They plodded through the deadly, unvarying tasks, and mated as they were told, like the automatons they were fast becoming. Jonathan laid down the letter, and stared out at the clanking factory. So this was why? Even as a child he had felt the oppression of this place, and had danced with joy on leaving it. The haggard, half-remembered face of his mother floated for a moment before his eyes. No wonder she had seemed always sad. I was the first Robertson to rebel. I had been educated in England. On my way home I stopped at Jamaica, fell in love with your mother, and without realizing the hell I was bringing her to, married her. Tom came with us to New Patmos. I considered myself something of a radical in those days. When I learned of conditions here, I demanded that my father free our labourers. The old man, he died a few months later, merely shrugged and declared they were free. Their unending toil and inbreeding have made machines of them, he said. They are helpless now. You must care for them, my son. You can never leave the island again lest they starve. God help me. I tried my best to make men and women of them again. You will see what success I had. Try in your turn if you must. It will be useless, but the effort will permit you to sleep. The centuries have dug a rut too deep for the creatures to climb out of. They have become like my canaries, poor. The letter ended as if the hand of death had snatched pen from paper. For a long while Jonathan stared at the pages. The singing of the canaries, their cages occupied every corner of the bedroom, finally roused him. "Tom." "Yes, sir." The old man had been waiting outside the door. "Turn all these damned birds loose." "But you'll need them to test the air in the mine, sir. The gas gets bad at times." "Turn them loose, I said, at once." "Yes, sir." Quietly the black went about the room, opening cage doors. Jonathan followed his progress with growing horror. The birds, so long accustomed to captivity, refused freedom. A few came to the opened wickets, then retreated to their perches with frightened twitters. "Yes, sir. Anything else, sir?" "Go down to the pier and tell Captain Parker to hold the steamer. We're sailing with him." "But you can't do that, sir. You can't leave your people to starve." The whites of Tom's eyes glistened. "You have to send out shipments of stones and the ultramarine dye which is made at the factory. You have to distribute the food which comes in." "Nonsense. I'll pay them off and arrange for a boat to pick them up if they want to leave the island. They'll get along." "You'd better see your people first." The servant pointed toward the cowering birds. "You don't understand." "All right, then. We'll visit the factory. Come on." Morosely he strode along the weed-grown path across the valley. Midway they passed the little cemetery where 6 generations of Robertsons lay side by side. "I had to bury him myself, sir." Tom indicated a fresh mound of earth. They couldn't help, couldn't perform a task they were not accustomed to. In contrast with the neglect apparent on the rest of the island, the factory, despite its age and ugliness, hummed with life. As they approached, they heard the clink of hammers and the endless flapping of belts. When his eyes became accustomed to the dimness inside, Jonathan saw long lines of men and women bent over ancient workbenches, operating the lathes and forges of another age. They were doing all manner of complicated tasks in complete silence and with perfect concentration. Not a worker glanced up as he entered. The tempo of toil continued without a break. "Are they always like this, Tom?" The heir of all the Robertsons felt his hair prickle. "Don't they ever talk?" "Always like this, sir. When the gong rings, they have their lunch. The next time it sounds, they march back to the barracks behind the factory. In the morning, it calls them to work at daybreak." "But what do they do when they're not working?" "Eat, sleep, breed." "And the children?" "They work too, as soon as they can walk. It is the law. They have obeyed it during 8 or more generations, for their lives are short. It's too late to change them now." Stopping before a time-blackened bench, Jonathan picked up a piece of blue stone upon which a gaunt, stoop-shouldered young man was working. The effect was instant and frightful. With a snarl like a dog from which one has snatched a bone, the labourer grabbed the jewel from the intruder's hand. Then, as he again began working upon it, his face resumed its previous vacant stare. "You see, sir," Tom said, "it's the same way in the mine. They've lost most human characteristics. Notice that one's fingers, long and slender for delicate work. And this one's so tough that he can reach right into his forge." "Have they lost the power of speech?" "Oh, no, sir. They talk, when speech is necessary in carrying on their work. Just a few words, though. Like parrots, I would say." Oppressed by the horror of this silent, noisy place, they hurried along until they came to a better lighted section of the building. There, a number of women were engaged in etching delicate designs on almost finished stones. Dressed in black, nun-like robes, they crouched over their work while their fingers flew. Most of them were ugly and toothless, with dirty hair and shoulders permanently rounded. A few retained some semblance of good looks and made pitiful attempts at adornment. One had a drooping flower in her unkempt locks. Another wore an ancient ring. Those little things sent a thrill through the newcomer. Perhaps. Glancing away from this group of harpies, Jonathan drew in his breath sharply. On a platform near a broken window sat a girl who was looking at him with a faint show of interest in her great sad eyes. Her chestnut hair was held back with a strip of cloth. Her robe was clean. Her face reminded him of a Watteau shepherdess. "Who is she?" he whispered. "The women's overseer, sir. She talks a bit." "Good morning," Jonathan addressed the girl hesitantly. "I'm the new master. Do you like to work here? Have you any complaints?" He stopped, feeling foolish, as he realized that, although she still was looking at him, her fragile fingers had not ceased their endless task of sorting little blue stones. "Good morning, new master," she answered in a voice faint from disuse. "I do like to work here. I have no She stumbled over the unfamiliar word. "What is your name?" "Joe." "Joe what?" "Joe." He detected a look of fright in her blue eyes. "Would you like to leave this place?" "No!" With a gasp, Joe dropped her eyes and sorted with increased speed. Jonathan thought of the fluttering canaries. "Would you like a holiday, Joe?" She did not answer. Her face was white, and her breath jerked. "Better leave her alone, sir," said Tom. "You're getting her all upset. Come, I'll show you the mine." Heartsick, he left the squat building through a tunnel which led into the cliff. Tom switched on a flashlight. By the aid of its beam, they scrambled down a long incline. The air was thick and fetid. Walls dripped with icy moisture. "What's that?" A shuffling sound nearby had startled him. "One of the miners, sir. They don't need lights any more. They seem to feel or smell the vein of lapis. Look." He swung the beam to disclose a naked horror which was scrabbling at the end of the tunnel with a crowbar. The creature snarled through a matted beard and hid its eyes. "The miners only come out after dark," said Tom. "They've almost lost the power of sight. Look out, here comes an ore car." He dragged his master aside as a loaded car trundled out of the depths and skittered by them on rickety wheels, pushed by another monster. "Good Lord," panted Jonathan. "Get me out of here before I go mad. This air—" "The pumps aren't adequate, sir. Your father was going to install new ones, but the miners don't seem bothered by the foulness. The air may become highly explosive. That's why we keep the canaries. But since the miners have stopped using lights—" He plodded toward the surface while his master walked close beside him as the one remaining link to the world of reality. Back in the factory workroom at last, Jonathan mounted a bench and shouted for attention. The belt flapped idly on. Work continued. Most of the labourers lifted their eyes to stare at him dully. "I am the new master," he yelled above the din. "I do not want you to work on Sunday. Turn off the power. Go home. Come back tomorrow. This is the day of rest." The belt flapped on. Most of them gaped at him without comprehension. In a far corner, however, an ancient and twisted man rose from his bench and started fumbling at his leather apron. After half a minute, another followed his example. "No!" Another voice, harsh and sharp as a steel file, cut through the uproar. "Work! Work is the law. God say, by the sweat of brow. Work ye can." It was the cadaverous individual with a snarl who was speaking. "Ye can!" "We can." The answer came in chorus, like a ragged thunderclap. The old man refastened his apron and sat down again, as did his companion. The belt flapped. "Now look here!" Jonathan was furious. "I said—" "It's no use, sir." Tom was plucking at his sleeve. "You might as well talk to the lapis. Now, come." At the mansion, Jonathan sat for hours with his head between his hands, trying to think of some way to lift the curse riveted on New Patmos. He waved away the luncheon which Tom brought, then, as the old man started to leave the room, called him back. "Who's in charge at the factory?" he asked. "There's nobody rightly in charge, sir. Things just run themselves." "Who is that creature with a voice like a squeaky hinge, then?" "Oh, that's Jock, the men's supervisor, sir. He only—" "Jock!" Jonathan caught his breath. "Could that be Jock Macpherson, 7th, a descendant of Sir Jonathan's original overseer?" "I wouldn't rightly know, sir, but you had better watch him. I think he is jealous." "Jealous? Why, for heaven's sake?" "Because you spoke to his girl Jo, sir. Under the law, they will mate soon to produce another generation of supervisors." "You're a doddering old fool!" Jonathan's face was pink. "Yes, sir. Anything else, sir?" Tom turned stiffly toward the door. I'm sorry, Tom. Forget it. I've got the jumps trying to figure out a way to shut down that factory. Can you suggest anything?" "You might try locking the doors tonight as soon as everybody is out, but—" "Splendid idea. That might break the chain. We'll try it." In the brief dusk after sunset, they slipped across the valley and padlocked the sagging doors of the plant. Then, as they turned to retrace their steps, Jonathan grasped the old man's arm. "I've been thinking," he said softly. "Perhaps I'm going at this thing backwards. Maybe I ought to try to win Jock over first. Do you know where he lives?" I think so, sir. Only—" "Lead the way, then." In silence they skirted the factory and reached the mews, which nestled under the cliffs like swallows' nests. The narrow alleys were unpaved and unlighted. Already the workers were asleep, or hiding, perhaps, Jonathan wondered, in the warren of tumble-down shacks. In no time Tom became hopelessly lost in the maze. Once they asked directions of an old crone hunched on a mouldering doorstep, and were answered with a gale of crazy laughter. All the while they felt hundreds of eyes watching their progress, mocking at them. "I'm sorry, sir." Tom shivered at last after several minutes of hammering on a door which he thought might be the right one had brought no response. "It's no use. We'll have to come back in daylight." "When Jock will be at the factory. Perhaps I can talk to him there, though. Let's get out of this." Jonathan rose from his tumbled bed before sun-up and set himself to watch the factory through a pair of field glasses. Despite the fact that the gong had not sounded as usual, workers already were streaming toward the plant. The first to reach the locked doors halted uncertainly, but did not turn away. They merely stood there like a herd of cattle. The scene reminded Jonathan unpleasantly of pictures of mill lockouts he had seen in newspapers. As he watched, with bated breath, a surging movement began to grow in the crowd. Good Lord! They were pushing at the heavy doors. The iron-bound panels sagged. A splintering crash sounded across the valley. The doors were down. The silent mob started moving across the threshold. Again his effort to break the spell had failed. "I told you, sir." Tom had entered the room unheard and was standing at his elbow like a venerable Satan. "Might as well make the best of it. Why don't you go back to England, marry a nice girl, and bring her back here?" He dodged with amazing nimbleness as his master lashed out with a long arm. "I beg your pardon, sir. No offence meant, no offence at all." "Very well. But stop calling me sir, and get these damned canary cages out of here before I smash them." "Yes, Mr. Johnny." Tom moved about the room, collecting the birds. "Don't take things so hard. You'll only become ill." For several days Jonathan wandered about the island, avoiding the sight of the factory, but the place fascinated him, and at last drew him back to its mildewed corridors. He might have been only a shadow so far as most of the workers were concerned. Jock remembered him, however, snarling softly and crouching more closely over his work when his master passed by, and the girl by the window even smiled faintly upon catching sight of him. On one of his trips, Jonathan found Joe outside the factory during lunch hours. "Would you take a walk with me?" he asked on the spur of the moment. "Walk? Yes. Not far. Gong," she answered shyly. He tried to take her arm, but she flinched away. Nevertheless, when he turned away, she wandered down the path beside him. Using simple, childish words, he tried to get her interest in the flowers, trees, and birds along the way, and fancied that he was arousing her dormant mind. At any rate, she did not notice that they had left the factory far behind until the recall gong sounded. Instantly she whirled and started running back down the path. In vain he pleaded with her not to hurry, that it didn't matter if she were late. She ran on without a word, as he had sometimes seen school-children run when they were tardy, her face puckered as though to cry, her breath short and rapid. At the factory door he caught and tried to hold her. She beat her fists against his breast and sobbed in a wild burst of hysteria. At last she twisted herself free and rushed to her bench. There, almost magically, her face resumed its sweet serenity as she began her accustomed task. Yet, as he returned home, defeated once more, Jonathan was certain that he had partially awakened her, and he also realized that, as Tom had hinted, he was falling under the spell of this strange, twisted being. She was almost an automaton, but not quite. No, she was more like a person obsessed by the craving for a narcotic. He clenched his fists and swore to save her, or to kill her in the attempt. A week later, when he believed the effect of Joe's fright had worn off, Jonathan posted himself outside the mews and waited for the morning gong. He told himself that he was looking for Jock, but his heart leaped when he saw the girl approaching before the harsh echoes of the first bell had died away. He noticed with delight that she was taking more care of her appearance than before. A white flower shone in her hair, which was newly washed and neatly combed. Her bare feet peeped from beneath the hem of a fresh robe. "Good morning, Joe," he smiled at her. "Would you like to see my house? It's not far. You have time." For a long moment she looked at him dubiously. Then her curiosity overcame her fear. "Yes, Joe will go. Must be back when second gong rings." "Come then, we must hurry." This time she let him hold her arm. "I found some new flowers in the valley this morning," he continued softly. "Flowers?" She glanced at him under fringed lashes. "Yes, like the one you wear in your hair. What is it called?" It called... She shook her head at last. "Joe, forget." "And this tree, all covered with blossoms. What is its name?" "Joe think it called Mimosa?" "Right. Well, here's the house. Come right in." "Oh, no, law say." "The devil with the law. It's my house. Come in." After repeated urgings, she crept through the big door. Her work completely forgotten for once, she marvelled at the lacy curtains, the waxed floors which made walking so difficult, and the paintings on the walls. While she was testing the softness of the big bed upstairs with open-mouthed astonishment, Jonathan slipped out of the room and locked the door. Tom, his white head bobbing with worry, was watching him from the landing. "I wouldn't have done it, Mr. Johnny," he muttered. "It would be better for you to get a girl in England or the States." "Damn you, shut your mouth!" his master exploded. "There's no danger. She can't get out. This may jolt her out of her rut. Then she can help the others." He was interrupted by the snarling clangor of the second gong, followed by a wild hammering on the upstairs door. "You better let her out." Tom's head was shaking worse than before. "I know your father." A terrified scream cut him short. Jonathan went up the stairs 3 at a time. Tearing open the door, he plunged inside, then halted, stunned. The room was empty. But not quite. Joe's strained white hands were clinging to the window-sill. "Wait, Joe!" he shouted. "Hold on, I'm coming." Instead of waiting, she relaxed her hold. He reached the window to see her crash into the iron porch railing 20 feet below. "She's dead, Tom." He looked up from Joe's still face a few minutes later. "Fractured her skull." His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was death in his heart. Now that it was too late, he realized that he had loved her. "Poor child! I treated her very badly, you know." "I told you so, Mr. Johnny. You can't do anything. They live in darkness." Suddenly losing his English stoicism, Tom dropped to his knees, threw his arms around his master's knees, and sobbed, "Oh, Mr. Johnny, I'm afraid." There, Tom." Although his heart was breaking, it warmed to this display of humanness in the old man. "We'll lick this thing yet. Tell you what. Tonight we'll go to the factory, barricade the doors and windows, keep the fools out until they come to their senses." "It won't be any use." Tom rose slowly, his fat old face drawn in stern lines. Nevertheless, we'll fight it out together, if you wish." "Very well, Tom." Jonathan stretched out his hand and grasped that of the other over the body of the dead girl. "Together it is, then." That night, after they had said a simple prayer over Joe's grave, they hurried to the plant, repaired the doors, and spent long hours barricading them and the windows from within. Often they felt eyes upon them, but no one interfered with their work. Dawn was breaking by the time they finished. The morning gong soon was followed by scuffling sounds of the gathering crowd outside. Like a pack of hounds, the workers sniffed around the building, trying to find an entrance. When this was unsuccessful, there was a long silence. Then, when the pair inside had begun to take hope, they heard the crash of some heavy weapon against the doors. "They're thinking a bit anyway," said Jonathan. "They've hit on the idea of using a log for a battering ram." The hammering gathered force and rhythm, and began to be accompanied by a grunting chant which sounded oddly familiar. "They're remembering something else." Tom held his jaw to stop his chattering teeth. "I haven't heard them sing for a score of years." "What is it they're chanting?" "It's Luther's hymn, 'A Mighty Fortress,' Mr. Johnny." "Rather appropriate, what? We'd better get some more work benches against those doors. They're sagging." As the unintelligible hymn reached its climax, the doors caved inward despite Jonathan's best efforts. The benches were pushed aside. The mob poured in. It might have ended there, with the creatures going quietly to work, except for the fact that the whole place was in disorder. For a moment the workers milled sullenly about, looking for their accustomed tools. Then Jock spotted the true intruders. "He!" shouted the man-monster, pointing wildly and shaking his matted hair. "He killed Joe! He shut doors! He laugh at law!" The ragged men and women shifted their bare feet uncertainly. For a few seconds Jock seemed at a loss, groping for words. Then a look of cunning overspread his hideous face. "He shut doors again!" yelled the mad overseer. "He burned down plant! We no can work! Kill him! Kill! Kill!" This time Jock got the response he had been seeking. The workers, more than 500 of them, surged forward, snarling deep in their throats. Jonathan took a step toward the mob, but Tom pulled him back. "Wait, Mr. Johnny. They know me. If anybody can check them, I can." The old man clambered onto one of the few upright benches and shouted for silence. For a moment he got it. Then Jock hurled a chisel. The blade slashed Tom's cheek. At the sight of blood, the crowd went wild and charged. Before Jonathan could make a move to save him, Tom was dragged from the bench. A scream rang out. A black arm reached upward. Then there was only a sound such as pigs make at a trough. Life, which before had seemed so bitter and worthless, became suddenly sweet to Jonathan. The factory had turned into a howling madhouse, but behind him was the entrance to the mine. He leaped through it and sprinted down the black tunnel. When he recovered from his hysteria, Jonathan found himself hopelessly lost in a maze of parallels. Controlling his nerves by sheer willpower, he crouched in the pitch darkness and waited. Would they forget him? The bloodlust he had seen on those half-animal faces did not reassure him. He listened, and could hear nothing but the blood drumming in his ears. Now that it was too late, he realized that he had gone about the whole thing clumsily, in the outmoded, swashbuckling, empire-building fashion. He had tried to do, in a few weeks, a job which required years, decades, perhaps a lifetime. He should have started by winning Jock's confidence, or, if that couldn't be done, he should have killed the monster outright. Without Jock's influence, the others might well return to sanity in a short time. Might what? He shook his head to clear his wandering thoughts. The heavy, gaseous air was choking him.
His mouth had become dry and gluey. Red spots danced before his eyes. What was that? He leaped to his feet, remembering that the miners needed light. A pebble, dislodged by his movement, rattled down the wall with a sound like thunder. Then he laughed shakily. The sound he had heard was the far-distant flapping of the factory belt. They had turned on the machinery. A long time later he thought he heard another sound, nearer this time. He pressed his knuckles against his lips to keep from screaming. He turned to run. But where? The sound had come again. On the other side now, it seemed. He picked up a piece of rock and hurled it with all its force. Nothing. Or was that the echo of a maniac laugh? "Get away, you hairy devil!" he yelled. "I have a gun here." No answer. Yet the blackness was peopled with horrors. Was he going crazy? He mustn't give way. Britishers have been in more ticklish spot than his and come out on top. England expects every man to pull himself together in an emergency. There must be some way out of this maze. "Tom," he whispered, "hand me your flashlight." "Sorry, Mr. Johnny," the answer came. "It was broken when they killed me." "Oh, that's right. I forgot you were dead, Tom. Can you help me out of this mess?" "Sorry, Mr. Johnny, but dying isn't so bad, though, honestly." "England expects! England expects!" Jonathan Robertson, 7th, was fighting hard to retain his sanity. There came a chuckling sound, not 10 feet away now. "Light! Light!" His shaking hands sought his pockets. "Ah, matches!" "Mind the gas, Mr. Johnny. Good old Tom, a shame he's dead." "I'll have to chance it." His voice was quite calm now. The match scraped against the sandpaper. "The devil! It didn't light! Steady now. Keep your paws off me just a moment longer, you scum. 1, 2, 3. This time the flame caught, flickered, was reflected for a split second in the eyes of a gaunt, stoop-shouldered young man at the other side of the tunnel, then burst into the searing glory of 1,000 suns. The End. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. And now for the next story. Strain by L. Ron Hubbard. Originally published in Astounding Science Fiction, April 1942. Narrated by Tom Trussel. It was unreasonable, he told himself, to feel no agony of apprehension. He was in the vortex of a time whirlwind, and here all stood precariously upon the edge of disaster, but stood quietly, waiting and unbreathing. No man who had survived a crash, survived bullets, survived the paralyzing rays of the guards, had a right to be calm. And it was not like him to be calm. His slender hands and even delicate features were those of an aristocrat, those of a sensitive thoroughbred whose nerves coursed on the surface, whose health depended upon the quietness of those nerves. They threw him into the domed room, and his space boots rang upon the metal floor, and the glare of savage lights bit into his skull scarcely less than the impact from the eyes of the enemy intelligence officer. The identification papers were pushed across the desk by this guard, and the intelligence officer scanned them. The brutish Saturnian countenance lighted and became interested. The slitted eyes flicked with satisfaction from one to the other of the two captured officers. "Captain Forrester de Wolf," said the man behind the desk. "Which one of you?" He looked steadily at the Saturnian,
and was a little amazed to find himself still calm. "I am he." "Ah, then you are Flight Officer Morrison." The captain's companion was sweating, and his voice had a tremor in it. His youthful, not too bright face twitched. "You got no right to do anything to us. We are prisoners of war, captured in uniform in line of combat duty. We treat Saturnians well enough when we grab them." This speech, or perhaps its undertone of panic, was of great satisfaction to the intelligence officer. He stood up with irony in his bearing and shook Captain de Wolfe by the hand. Then, less politely, but with more interest, bowed slightly to Flight Officer Morrison. The intelligence officer sat down. "Ah, yes," he said, looking at the papers. "Fortunes of war. You came down into range of the batteries and, well, you came down. You gentlemen don't accuse the Saturnians of a lack in knowing the rules of war, I trust? But there was a false candour there. We will give you every courtesy as captured officers. Your pay until the end of the war, suitable quarters, servants, good food, access to entertainment, and a right to look after your less fortunate enlisted captives." There was no end to the statement. It hung there, waiting for an additional qualification. And then the intelligence officer looked at them quickly, falsely, and said, "Of course, that is contingent upon your willingness to give us certain information." Flight Officer Morrison licked overly dry lips. He was young. He had heard many stories about the treatment, even the torture, the Saturnians gave their prisoners. And he knew that as a staff officer, the Saturnians would know his inadvertent possession of the battle plan so all-important to this campaign. Morrison flicked a scared glance at his captain, and then tried to assume a blustering attitude. Captain de Wolfe spoke calmly, a little surprised at himself that he could be so calm in the knowledge that as aide to General Bellantine he knew far more than was good to know. "I am afraid," said the captain quietly, "that we know nothing of any use to you." The intelligence officer smiled and read the papers again. "On the contrary, my dear captain, I think you know a great deal. It was not clever of you to wear that staff aiguillette on a reconnaissance patrol. It was not clever of you to suppose that merely because we had never succeeded in forcing down a G434 such as yours, that it could not be done. And it is not at all clever of you to suppose that we have no knowledge of a pending attack, a very broad attack. We have that knowledge. We must know more." His smile was ingratiating. "And you, naturally, will tell us." "You go to hell," said Flight Officer Morrison, hysteria lurking behind his eyes. Now, do not be so hasty, gentlemen," said the intelligence officer. "Sit down, smoke a cigarette with me, and settle this thing." Neither officer made a move toward the indicated chairs. Through Morrison's mind coursed the crude atrocity stories which had been circulated among the troops of Earth, stories which concerned Earth soldiers lashed to ant-hills and honey injected into their wounds, stories which dealt with a courier skinned alive, square inch by square inch, stories about a man staked out, eyelids cut away, to be let go mad in the blaze of Mercurian noon. Captain de Wolfe was detached, in a dull and disinterested way, standing back some feet from himself and watching the clever young staff captain emotionlessly regard the sly Saturnian. The intelligence officer looked from one to the other. He was a good intelligence officer. He knew faces, could feel emotions telepathically, and he knew exactly what information he must get. The flight officer could be broken. It might take several hours and several persuasive instruments, but he could be broken. The staff captain could not be broken, but because he was an intelligent, sensitive man, he could be driven to the brink of madness His mind could be warped, and the information could thus be extracted. It was too bad to have to resort to these expedients. It was not exactly a gentlemanly way of conducting a war. But there were necessities which knew no rules, and there was a Saturnian general staff which did not now believe in anything resembling humanity. "Gentlemen," said the intelligence officer, looking at his cigarette and then at his long sharp nails, "we have no wish to break your bodies, wreck your minds, and discard you. That is useless. You are already beaten. The extraction of information is, with us, a science. I do not threaten. But unless we learn what we wish to learn, we must proceed. Now, why don't you tell me all about it here and now, and save us this uncomfortable and regrettable necessity?" He knew men. He knew Earthmen. He knew the temper of an officer of the United States of Earth, and he did not expect them to do anything but what they did, stiffen up, become hostile and angry. But this was the first step. This was the implanting of the seed of concern. He knew just how far he could go. He smiled at them. "You," he continued, "are young. Women doubtless love you. Your lives lay far ahead of you. It is not so bad to be an honored prisoner, truly. Why court the possibility of broken bodies, broken minds, warped and twisted spirits? There is nothing worth that. Your loyalty lies to yourselves primarily. A state does not own a man. Now, what have you to say?" Flight Officer Morrison glanced at his captain. He looked back at the intelligence officer. "Go to hell," he said. There were no blankets or bunks in the cell, and there was no light save when the guard came, and then there was a blinding torrent of it. The walls sloped toward the center. There was no flat floor, but a rounded continuation of the walls. The entire place was built of specially heat-conductive metal, and the 2 prisoners had been stripped of all their clothes. Captain de Wolfe sat in the freezing ink, and tried to keep as much of himself as possible from contacting the metal. For some hours a water drop had been falling somewhere on something tinny, and it did not fall with regularity. Sometimes there were 3 splashes in rapid succession, and then none for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, or even for a minute. The body would build itself up to the next drop, would relax only when it had fallen, would build up for the expected interval, and then wait, and finally slack down in the thought that it would come no longer. Suddenly the drop would fall, a very small sound to react so shatteringly upon the nerves. The captain was trying to keep his thoughts in a logical regulation pattern, despite the weariness which assailed him, despite the shock of chill which racked him every time he forgot and relaxed against the metal. How hot was this foul air! How cold was this wall! "Forrester," groped Morrison's voice. "Hello?" startling himself with the loudness of this tone. "Is it possible they'll keep us here forever?" "I don't think so," said the captain. "After all, our information won't be any good in any length of time. If you are hoping for action, I think you'll get it." Is this good sense, to hold out?" "Listen to me," said the captain. "You've been in the service long enough to know that if one man fails, he is liable to take the regiment along with him. If we fail, we'll take the entire army. Remember that. We can't let General Ballantyne down. We can't let our brother officers down. We can't let the troops down. And we can't let ourselves down. Make up your mind to keep your mouth shut, and you'll feel better." It sounded, thought the captain, horribly melodramatic. But he continued, "You haven't had the grind of West Point. A company, a regiment, or an army has no thought of the individual. It cannot have any thought, and the individual, therefore, cannot fail, being a vital part of the larger body. If either of us break now, it would be like a man's heart stopping. We're unlucky enough to be that heart at the moment." "I've heard," said Morrison, in a gruesome attempt at jocularity, "that getting gutted is comfortable compared to some of the things these Saturnians can think up." The captain wished he could believe fully the trite remark he must offer here. "Anything they can do to us won't be half of what we'd feel in ourselves if we did talk." "Sure," agreed Morrison. "Sure, I see that." But he had agreed too swiftly. The shock of the light was physical, and even the captain cowered away from it and threw a hand across his eyes. There was a clatter and a slither, and a tray laid in the middle of the cell, having come from an unseen hand at the bottom of the door. Morrison squinted at it with a glad grin. There were several little dishes sitting around a big metal cover of the type used to keep food warm. Morrison snatched at the cover and whipped it off, and then, cover still raised, he stared. On the platter a cat was lying, agony and appeal in its eyes, crucified to a wooden slab with forks through its paws, cockroaches crawling and eating at its skinned side. The cover dropped with a clatter and was then snatched up. The heavy edge of it came down on the skull of the cat, and with a sound between a sigh and a scream, it relaxed, dead. Grey-faced, Morrison put the cover back on the dish. The captain looked at the flight officer, and tried to keep his attention upon Morrison's reaction, and thus avoid the illness which fought upward within him. The light went out, and they could feel each other staring into the dark, could feel each other's thoughts. From the captain came the compulsion to silence. From Morrison, a struggling but unspoken panic. One sentence ran through Captain de Wolf's mind over and over. "He is going to break at the first chance he has. He is going to break at the first chance he has. He is going to break at the first chance he has. He is—" Angrily he broke the chain. How could he tell this man what it would mean? Himself a point officer, it was hard for him to reach out and understand the reaction of one who had been until recently a civilian pilot. How could he harden in an hour or a day the resolution to loyalty? It was a step ahead, a tribute to de Wolf's understanding that he realized the difference between them. He knew how carefully belief in service had been built within himself, and he knew how vital was that belief. But how could he make Morrison know that 50,000 Earthmen, his friends, the hope of Earth, might die if the time and plan of the attack were disclosed? Futilely, he wished that they had not been there at the council which had decided it. That knowledge of it had been necessary for them to do a complete scout of the situation for General Ballantyne. If no word of this came to the Saturnians, then this planet might be wholly cleared of the enemy with one lightning blow by space and land. Suddenly, de Wolf discovered that he had been wondering for a long time about his daughter, who had been reported by his wife as having a case of measles. Angrily, he yanked his mind from such a fatal course. He could not allow himself to be human, to know that people would sorrow if he went. He was part of an army, and as part of that army he had no right to personality or self. He was here. He could not fail. He could not let Morrison fail. If only that drop would stop falling. It was both relief and agony when the light went on once more. The captain had no conception of the amount of time which had passed, was only conscious of the misery of his body and the determination not to fail. The door swung open, and a dark hooded Saturnian infantryman stood there. An officer beyond him beckoned and said, "We want a word with Morrison, the flight officer, if you please." Not until Morrison had been gone an hour or more did Captain de Wolf begin to crumble within. The irregular, loud drop, the continued shocks of a body sweating in the hot air and then touching the icy metal, the fact that Morrison, The man was not a regular. He was a civilian, less than a year in the service. Unlike Captain de Wolf, he was not a personality moulded into a military machine, and a civilian, having earned a personality of his own through the necessity to seek for self, could not be drawn too far down the road of agony without breaking. Captain de Wolf, sick with physical and nervous discomfort, was ground down further by his fear that Morrison would crack, and as time went by and Morrison was not returned, de Wolf became convinced. Surging up at last, he battered at the door. No answer came to him. The lock was steadfast. Wildly he turned and beat at the plates of the cell, and not until pain reached his consciousness from his bloodied fists did he realize the danger in which he stood. He himself was cracking. He stilled the will to scream at the dropping water. He carefully took himself in hand, and felt the light die in his eyes. He had no hope of escape. The Saturnians would be too clever for that. But he could no longer trust himself to wait, and he used his time by examining the whole of the cell. The walls were huge, unyielding plates, and there was no window, but passing back and forth, he repeatedly felt the roughness of a grate underfoot. This he finally investigated, a gesture more than a hope, for this served as the room's only plumbing, and was foul and odorous, and could lead nowhere save into a sewage pipe. For the space of several loud and shattering drops, de Wolf stood crouched, loose grate in hand, filled with disbelief. For there was a faint ray of light reflected from somewhere below, and in that light it could be seen that there was room enough to pass through. Suddenly crafty, he listened at the door, then, with quick, sure motions, slid into the foul hole and pulled the grate into place over his head. The light, not yet seen, was beckoning to him at the end of a tunnel in which he could just crouch. He crawled in the muck for 200 feet before he came to the light, and here he stopped, staring upward. The hope in him flickered, waned, and nearly vanished in a tidal wave of despair, for the light came from an upper grate 14 feet above the floor of the tunnel, far out of reach upon a slimy, unfloored wall. He tried to leap for it, and fell back, slipping and cruelly banging his head as he dropped. Again he took solid hold of himself. He forced his trained mind to think, forced his trained body to obey. He stood a long way back from himself, and critically observed his actions and impulses as though he was something besides a man, and the man was on parade. He looked farther along the tunnel, and fumbled his way away from the light. He was sure he would have another outlet presented to him by fate. He could not be led this far without some recompense, and he felt in the top of the tunnel for a grate which might lead out through an empty cell. The tunnel curved, and then a new sound made him fumble before he took another step. There was a drop there, an emptiness which might extend 10 feet or 100. He had to return, or chance it. The water which sluggishly gurgled about his ankles spilled over the soft lip of the hole, and dropped soundlessly. Suddenly he was filled with sickness and panic and premonition. This foul trap into which he had ventured hemmed him close, imprisoned him, would embrace him for some awesome purpose, and never give him up. He forced himself into line. He froze his terror. He dropped blindly over the lip of the hole. He was not shaken, for he had dropped less than 6 feet, and the bottom was soft. He crouched, his emotions clashing, disgust and relief. And then when he looked about him again, he felt the mad surge of hope, for there was light ahead. Floundering and splashing and steadying himself against the walls, he gained the bend and saw the blinding force of daylight. For some little while he could not look directly at it, nor could his wits embrace the whole of the promise that light offered. But at last, when his pupils were contracted to normal and his realization distilled into reason, he went forward and looked down. Once more his hope died. Here was a sheer drop of nearly 100 feet, a cliff face which offered no slightest hold, greased by the sewage and worn smooth by the water. Clinging forlornly to the edge, he scanned the great dome of the military base a mile overhead, scanned the cluster of metal huts on the plain before him, watched far-off dots which were soldiers. There was a roar overhead, and he drew back lest he be seen by the small scout plane which cruised beneath the dome. When its sound had faded, he again ventured a glance out, looking up to make sure he was not seen from above. And once more hope flared. For the wall above this opening offered grips in the form of projecting stones, and the climb was less than 20 feet. It was difficult to swing out of the opening and grab the first rock. It took courage to expose himself to the sentries who, though 2,000 yards away, could pick him easily off the wall if they noticed him. The rock he grabbed came loose in his hand, and he nearly hurtled down the cliff. He crouched, panting, denied, wearied beyond endurance with the sudden shock of it. And then he stood off from himself again, and snarled a command to go on and up. The next rock he trusted held, and in a moment he was glued to the face of the sheer wall, making weary muscles respond to orders. Why he was tired he did not understand, for he had done no great amount of physical exertion. But rock by rock, as he went up, his energy flooded from him, and left him in a hazed realm of semi-consciousness which threatened uncaring surrender. He rested for longer and longer intervals between lifts, and what had been 20 feet seemed to stretch to a tortured infinity. He could not believe that he had come within 2 feet of the top, but, staring up, he saw that he should believe it. A savage will took hold of him, and he reached out for the next handhold. It did not exist. He fumbled and groped across the smooth face above him. He stretched to reach the lip so near him, and then he realized that, near as he was, he could not go farther. Already his bleeding hands refused to hold beyond the next few seconds. A foot slipped, and in sweating terror he wildly clawed for his hold. His right hand slipped loose. A red haze of strain covered his vision. The foot came free, and the tendons of his right arm were stretched to the snapping point. He knew he was going, knew that he would fall, knew that Morrison would sell an army to the gods of slaughter. His right hand numbed and lost its grip, and he started to fall. There was a wrench which tore muscles and nerves, and something was around his wrist. He was not falling. He was dangling over emptiness, and something had him from above. They pulled him up over the edge, and dropped him in an exhausted, broken huddle upon the gravel of the small plateau, and at last, when he opened his eyes, it was to see the grinning face of the intelligence officer and the stolid guards. "Usually," said the intelligence officer in an offhand voice, "they make it up and over by tearing a grip out of the cliff with their fingernails. You, however, are of a much more delicate nervous structure, it seems. I rather thought you'd fail where you did. One gets to know these things after some practice." Captain de Wolfe lay where they had dropped him. A dull haze of beaten anger clouded his sight, and then dropped away from him, and left him naked, filthy, and alone among his country's enemies. Diffidently the guards picked him up and lugged him toward the small buildings. They took him down a corridor and into a large, strange room. Glad to be quit of this, they put him in a chair and strapped his wrists down. Captain de Wolfe made no resistance. He did not look up. The intelligence officer walked gracefully back and forth, slowly touring the room. He stopped and lighted a cigarette. "It was really quite useless, that escape of yours," he said. "Your friend Morrison talked to the limit of his knowledge. He gave us troops, divisions to be used, state of equipment, general battle plan. In fact, everything but 2 small facts which he did not know." He came nearer to de Wolf. "He was not able to recall the time of the attack, or the assembly point after it had succeeded, if it did succeed. You are to give us that data, for, as a staff officer, you, of course, know. Brawls, make ready with number 4. Captain de Wolf tried to rally. He tried to feel rage against Morrison. He tried to realize that an army would perish because of this day's work. He could not think, could not feel. They were rolling some kind of machine toward him, and the wriggly thing called Brawls was adjusting something on it. "I won't tell you anything," said the wolf leadenly. A dog was pulled out of a cage and placed on a table where it was strapped down. It whimpered and tried to lick at the hand of the soldier who did the work. Brawls, face hidden in a hood, worked expertly with a little track. On this was a small car having 2 high sides and neither back nor front. It ran on a little track which had been widened to accommodate the width of the dog. Brawls touched a button, and from jets on either side of the car small streams shot forth with sudden ferocity. These jets sprayed water under tremendous hydraulic pressure, jets which could cut wood faster than any saw, and which hissed hungrily as they began to roll toward the dog. Captain de Wolf tried to drop his eyes. He could not. The little car crept up on the dog, and then the jets began to carve away, a fraction of an inch at a time. De Wolf managed to look away. The shrieks of agony which came from the dog carved through de Wolf. "I won't tell you anything," he said. They stretched out his arm and fixed the track on either side of it. They started the car toward his outstretched hand. Fixedly he watched it coming. To the persuasive drawl of the intelligence officer he said, "I won't tell you anything." A few hours later, the intelligence officer was making out his report. He stopped after he had written the caption and the date, and gazed at his long, sharp fingernails stained with nicotine. Then he sighed and resumed his writing. Intelligence report. Base 34D, Mercury. Adsama 452. Today, interrogated 2 officers captured from Earth reconnaissance plane. Captain Forrester de Wolf and Flight Officer Morrison. Captain de Wolf, under Procedure 23, escape tactic, revealed nothing. Later, he was given Procedures 45, 97, 21, and 6. He died without talking. Flight Officer Morrison was taken from the cellar to the chamber. He was very combative. Procedures 45, 97, and 6 were employed. Despite state of subject, he was able to get at the automatic of a guard in a moment of carelessness and succeeded in retaining it even after he was shot. Rather than risk the divulgence of data, Flight Officer Morrison blew out his brains. The guard is under arrest. From this attempt and the stubbornness of the enemy, I conclude that there may be some attack in the making, but, as our own scouts have discovered nothing, I do not expect it in this quarter for some time. Dror Shadma, Captain, Saturnian Imperials Intelligence. At headquarters of the 3rd Space Army, United States of Earth, General Ballantyne sat massively at his field desk, impatiently going through a sheaf of reports. "Belts," he brayed at an aide, "tell Colonel Strawn that whether he thinks regulation hold-down belts are useless or not, his troops will wear them and parade with them." "Yes, sir," said the aide timidly. He had a report in his hand, and was not very anxious to give it. "Well," said General Ballantyne sharply, "what have you there?" "It's a report, sir. Captain de Wolf and Flight Officer Morrison are missing on reconnaissance. They are unreported for a day and a half." Morrison? De Wolfe? Oh, yes, De Wolfe. General Ballantyne was perfectly silent for a moment. Then, in an altered tone, Morrison. I don't know the man. I don't know. He was silent again, so that his abrupt return to activity was the more startling. Post an order for a council of officers, and have another aide appointed to me. Damn it, that was a neat plan of attack, too. You're changing the plan, sir? General Ballantyne snorted. They'll wear those hold-down safety belts. I'll change that plan of attack. I don't know, can't know, what the Saturnians found out. I don't think De Wolfe, but it makes no difference. I'd have to know, and that's impossible. There's time to change. Post that notice.
The end. Subscribe for your daily stories of futures past. This is what the future looked like many, many years ago.